Eating in Tudor England wasn't simply about putting food into your mouth and hoping none of it tried to kill you. It was a social event, a moral test, and occasionally a public performance where every bite, blink, and breath betrayed your place in the grand machinery of status. You didn't sit down to dinner. You enrolled in a living examination where everyone else at the table silently graded you, like a jury that hated joy. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To modernise, a Tudor meal might look like organised chaos. Meat piled high, bread used as plates, ale flowing with more enthusiasm than common sense. But beneath the hearty aromas and questionable food safety lurked a rigid system of unwritten laws, enforced not with statutes but with raised eyebrows, stiff posture, and the ever-present threat of looking like someone who didn't belong. The first thing you must understand is this. Tudor society did not trust you to behave on your own. Not at the table, not in the church, not anywhere. These were considered one of the most vulnerable moments for the social order. When people gather to eat, they stop working, they relax, they talk, they show their true selves, and that, according to Tudor logic, was unacceptable without supervision. So a meal became a chance to demonstrate your discipline, your breeding, and most importantly, your ability to follow rules so detailed that even the rules had rules. From the moment you approached the table, eyes tracked you. Were your clothes appropriate? Did you greet the host correctly? Did you bow too little, or heaven help you too much? The Tudors treated seating arrangements the way modern corporations treat hierarchy charts, with more intensity than emotional stability. If you walked toward the wrong seat, you might as well have walked up to the monarch himself and asked if he would mind switching shirts with you. One misplaced shuffle toward a chair could turn you into the evening's scandal. Did you see him? Sat himself right beside the host as if he invented manners. Once seated, properly, ideally, you were expected to transform into a creature of perfect decorum. No slouching, no fidgeting, no looking like you were thinking about slouching or fidgeting. The Tudors believed posture indicated moral strength. If your back bent, so did your principles. A straight spine was proof that you possessed self-control, or at least the painful awareness that someone important was watching. And everyone was watching. Dinner in a Tudor household was a carefully orchestrated ritual where each person evaluated everyone else, creating a social ecosystem built on silent judgment. Eating became a performance but not the fun, kind with applause. This was the kind of performance where doing it well simply meant no one noticed you at all. To be invisible was success, to be seen was danger. The only acceptable spotlight was the burning candle on the table, and even that probably glared judgmentally. It wasn't just about following rules, it was about revealing who you really were through your reaction to the rules. Did you wait patiently for the highest-ranking person to begin eating? Or did you stare at your food like a starving dog staring at a butcher shop window? Did you carve your meat confidently, or did your trembling hand suggest the turkey was winning the battle? Did you speak when spoken to, or did you believe your opinions mattered? Every gesture became data in the Tudor social experiment. The food itself, ironically, mattered the least. Whether you enjoyed it was irrelevant. Whether it was safe was optional, but whether you showed the right respect while eating it, that was essential. A Tudor dinner wasn't about nourishment, it was about proving you belonged. Your ability to sit calmly before a plate of suspiciously grey meat without flinching showed fortitude. Your refusal to reach for food until invited demonstrated humility, and your success in not making a single sound while chewing confirmed to everyone that you were civilized. Only beasts chewed loudly, and people who were soon to be the subject of gossip chewed even louder. The host watched, the servants watched, the neighbours watched, your enemies watched with extra enthusiasm. And everyone documented your behaviour in the private notebook of their mind. He reached too quickly, someone noted. She fidgeted, someone whispered. He lifted his cup like he was storming a castle, another murmured. Nothing was forgotten. And if you misbehaved just a little too noticeably, the social consequences clung to you like the lingering scent of roasted lamb. Impossible to get rid of and discussed long after you'd hoped everyone had moved on. What made Tudor meals truly suffocating, though, was that you couldn't opt out. Refusing an invitation was its own kind of insult. Showing up meant being judged. The only winning move was to endure the evening without committing an etiquette crime, a challenge roughly equal to exiting a maze blindfolded while the maze itself actively dislikes you. So yes, eating was never just eating. It was a ritual engineered to reinforce obedience. A display of who controlled the table and who feared being controlled. It was a daily audition for social acceptance performed with a straight back, silent chewing, and the knowledge that one misplaced bite could haunt you for months. The good news, you didn't starve. The bad news, you were never truly off stage. If you've ever walked into a modern cafeteria and instinctively known which tables you shouldn't sit at, congratulations, you already understand Tudor dining. The difference. In Tudor England, choosing the wrong table wasn't just awkward, it was a declaration of social rebellion, the kind that made people gasp, drop their bread trenchers, and mentally draft your obituary. Meals were not communal gatherings, they were living diagrams of the social hierarchy, arranged with the precision of a military parade and the emotional tension of a family reunion where no one actually likes each other. At the heart of Tudor table politics was a strict rule. You sat only with people who matched your rank, or were at least close enough not to contaminate the atmosphere. This wasn't snobbery. No, this was order. Social order. Cosmic order. The kind of order that Henry VIII insisted on right before doing something spectacularly disorderly. To sit at the wrong table was to question the entire structure of society. And Tudor society did not appreciate questions. Every household, from a farmer's cottage to a noble estate, enforced some version of this division. The grander the house, the stricter the boundaries. In great noble halls, the dining arrangement resembled a human pyramid. The closer you were to the top, the more visible, privileged, and plate-worthy your experience became. The people at the top table got the cleanest trenchers, the best wines, the freshest cuts of meat, and probably fewer unpleasant surprises in their pudding. Everyone else adjusted expectations. But the real power wasn't in the food. It was in the people you were allowed to sit with. Eating wasn't merely nourishment. It was social exposure. You were seen, examined, measured. Others judged not only your manners, but the very company you kept. And the Tudors believed that sitting beside someone lower than you dragged you downward, socially, morally, and possibly spiritually. You didn't just risk catching their coarseness, you risked catching their reputation. For nobles, this rule became a tool of self-preservation. To sit with the wrong person was like publicly announcing, "I have misunderstood the natural order of the universe." Fellow aristocrats would make a note of it. Lady Catherine sat beside the man who manages the stables, someone might say, brows raised so high they threatened to detach. How democratizing, and how unfortunate. But even for lower-ranking people, the rules were strict. A yeoman didn't sit with a gentleman, a servant didn't sit with a yeoman, a scullery maid didn't sit with anyone unless ordered to, and even then people questioned whether chairs were appropriate for her species. The Tudors loved categories the way we love dessert menus, too much, too seriously, and with consequences. At great feasts, the tables formed a visible ladder from the noblest attendees down to the humblest servants, each placement a physical map of social value. The high table was the pinnacle of existence, positioned slightly elevated, making its occupants both literally and figuratively above everyone else. Sitting then meant you were important, or at least important enough to be watched like a falcon watches a mouse. The tables below were arranged in descending rank, each tier assigned to people with fewer privileges and more responsibilities. The further you sat from the head of the hall, the more your meal resembled a loose assembly of edible objects rather than food. You didn't complain. Complaining implied entitlement, and entitlement was reserved for the people who could ruin you. But what made Tudor seating painfully funny, in a bleak, historically accurate way, was how deeply people sensed the danger of social proximity. Sitting too near someone above you risked looking presumptuous. Sitting too near someone below you risked looking self-sabotaging. Every seat carried political implications. Choosing one was like choosing a faction. Imagine a man of middling rank entering the hall. Failing to judge his proper place could destroy him. Sit too low, you've insulted yourself. People will whisper that you don't know your own worth. Sit too high, you've insulted everyone else. People will whisper that you think you're better than you are. And there is no faster path to Tudor disgrace than someone thinking you think you're important. The Tudors believed that hierarchy preserved peace. After all, if everyone knew exactly where to sit, they might not attempt to stab each other with carving knives over perceived slights. Yet ironically, these seating laws created more tension than they resolved. One misplaced seating decision could ignite hostility that lasted generations. Do you remember the Feast of 92, someone would mutter 20 years later, when his grandfather sat one place too high? Scandalous. Among royalty, the rules became even more absurd. Sharing a table with the monarch wasn't a privilege, it was a responsibility. You sat in the correct posture, spoke only when allowed, and never ever acted like a person with voluntary muscle control. Sitting too close to the king without permission was not just social overreach, it was borderline treason. Even in small households, the divide persisted. Masters ate at the main table, senior servants sometimes at a side table, junior servants at another. And the lowest staff, the people who scrubbed cauldrons and peeled vegetables, rarely sat at all. Eating was staggered by rank, schedule and necessity. The table was not a shared space. It was a ranking system disguised as furniture. So in Tudor England, choosing where to sit wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about preference. It wasn't even about access to better food. It was about knowing your place with the kind of accuracy normally reserved for astronomy. The good news, you had a seat. The bad news, you better pray it was the right one. If the last part explained who you could sit with, this one explains the next horror. Where, exactly, you were allowed to plant your Tudor backside. Because in Tudor England, chairs weren't neutral objects. They were social declarations, wooden, uncomfortable declarations that told the entire room where you ranked, what you deserved, and how seriously people should take you. Choosing or being assigned a seat was the closest many people came to receiving a public performance review. To modernise, a dining hall looks like a place where people eat. But in Tudor society, it was the architectural equivalent of a sorting hat. Walk into a hall, and the entire room silently assessed where you belonged. Not where you wanted to be, where you were allowed to be. You could no more choose a seat at random than you could choose to overthrow the monarchy. Both actions were equally unwise and equally memorable. A Tudor hall was arranged with military precision, and at the heart of it all was the high table, the place where power sat, literally and symbolically elevated, often on a raised platform called a dais. If you received an invitation to the high table, you didn't just get a meal, you got a temporary seat in the hierarchy's spotlight. People didn't look at the food you ate. They looked at you, perched up there like a decorative symbol of social order, enjoying better cuts of meat and better chances of surviving the evening without humiliation. Below the high table stretched a series of lower tables, each a step down the social ladder. Picture a glacier of wood and elbows running through the hall, diminishing in importance the farther it moved from the dais. People at the top enjoyed the privilege of seeing and being seen. People at the bottom enjoyed drafts, dim lighting, and the faint possibility that no one important would notice their inevitable mistakes. The Tudors adored physical markers of rank, and no marker was more visible than distance from authority. The closer you sat to the host, the more valuable you were, at least for that meal. One seat closer meant one step up the invisible social staircase. One seat further meant one step down. People tracked these changes with obsessive precision. A shift in your seat placement from one dinner to the next functioned like a living barometer of your worth. If last month you sat 3 places from the host and tonight you're 5 places away, you can expect questions. Did you anger someone? Is your favour declining? Have you lost money? Are you dying? Tudor guests whispered these speculations the way modern people gossip about celebrity scandals, enthusiastically and without mercy. And the reverse was just as dangerous. Being moved up the table could attract positive attention, but too much attention was rarely a blessing. Suddenly you had enemies. Suddenly people wondered why you'd been honoured. Suddenly someone at the same rank as you started calculating how to remove you from their path. And they might not have needed poison. They simply needed enough influence to nudge you a few seats back down the hall next meal. Even within the same table, your exact spot mattered. Sitting on the right-hand side of the host implied favour. Sitting on the left might suggest you were useful but not trusted. Being placed directly across from someone with higher rank was prestigious, unless the seating arrangement made you a direct audience for their every bite, which could become its own form of torture. And let's talk about chairs. Most people didn't get them. That's right. A surprising number of Tudor diners sat on benches. Hard, unyielding benches that made you rethink every decision that led you to this point in life. Chairs were symbols of authority and were reserved for the elite. The closer you were to the dais, the more likely you were to sit on an actual chair with an actual back. Lower down the hall, furniture became more interpretive. Seat might mean a long plank that definitely hurt. But the most humiliating placement was being seated at the far ends of the lower tables, where drafts slipped under the doors, lighting was poor, and you were basically eating in the atmospheric misery zone. If anyone in this zone was caught speaking too loudly, laughing or acting above their seat, they were corrected with the kind of speed that made it clear their place was not up for debate. There were other subtler signals too. The angle of the table relative to the host, your proximity to the hearth, and even the visibility of your seat to the rest of the room all encoded messages about your value. To sit facing the host meant you were worthy of being looked at. To sit facing the wall meant you were here for the food and nothing else. Worst of all was the shifting nature of this system. Your seat could change at any time, and everyone noticed. If the host promoted you closer, it was a sign you were rising. If you were quietly nudged further down, you spent the rest of the evening pretending nothing was wrong, while your mind spiraled like a doomed Tudor spreadsheet. In modern times, if your friend sits you at the end of a long dinner table, you might shrug and think, well, someone had to sit here. In Tudor England, sitting at the end meant something. It meant everyone else was more important. It meant you were low enough that your mistakes didn't damage the room's atmosphere. It meant your opinions were optional. And so the room, the furniture, the spacing, the angles, all of it formed a silent, powerful system. The Tudors didn't need to write these rules down. They lived them, they breathed them, the dining hall enforced them. The good news? The chairs stayed where they were. The bad news? Your reputation didn't. If you thought the Tudors were obsessive about where you sat, wait until you discover how they felt about when you lifted your fork, well, your fingers, since forks were still suspicious foreign objects with questionable morals. Timing at the Tudor table wasn't just etiquette. It was a moral test wrapped in a patience exam wrapped in a trap. Put simply, you did not eat before your superior, not a nibble, not a crumb, not even an absent-minded sniff at your bread trencher. Eating too early was the Tudor equivalent of walking into your boss's office and sitting in their chair with your feet up. Except worse, because at least your boss doesn't believe God himself arranged the seating hierarchy. The rule was simple, but its consequences were immense. Once seated, you stared at your food like a medieval portrait, absolutely still, emotionally restrained, and pretending you weren't dying inside. The Tudors fully expected that everyone at the table, no matter how starving from a day of labour, walking, or pretending to enjoy court politics, would wait with perfect composure until the highest-ranking person took their first bite. That person could be the monarch, the master of the house, a noble guest, or the ranking officer in a military camp. Whoever it was, their mouth was the starting gun. Till that jaw moved, all food was forbidden terrain. The feast might have smelled magnificent, roasted meats glistening under candlelight, spices hinting at distant trade routes, bread steaming with impossible temptation. But your hands were to remain perfectly still on the table. And let's be clear, This wasn't simply about politeness. This was enforced humility. The Tudors lived in a world with rigid social hierarchies, and one of the clearest ways to reinforce those hierarchies was through hunger. Waiting to eat proved that you knew your place. It proved you had discipline. It proved you weren't an animal. And above all, it proved you were willing to suppress your own very reasonable human needs until someone more important gave you permission to be alive again. The higher up the social ladder you interacted, the more dramatic this waiting ritual became. It could last a few seconds, or it could last an eternity. Ever sat at a restaurant with someone who insists on waiting for everyone's meal to arrive before taking a bite? The Tudors would have looked at that and said, "Adorable, but let's raise the stakes." Imagine this. You've been working since dawn. You sit down to dinner. Your food is right there, touchable, smellable, taunting you. But the master of the estate is busy discussing politics, or laughing too long at a joke, or arriving fashionably late because time is a concept meant for lesser mortals. Meanwhile, your stomach is attempting to defect from your body, yet you wait. You do not break. Because breaking isn't just rude, it's dangerous. People were watching, always watching. In Tudor society, eating early was interpreted as greed, and greed was interpreted as moral failing, and moral failing was interpreted as, well, gossip fodder. And gossip lasted longer than most Tudor lifespans. Consider the repercussions. If someone saw you take a bite before your superior, they might gasp theatrically, clutch their pearls if they owned pearls, and make a mental note to never let you near their table again. The offence implied that you did not respect order. It suggested you might not respect authority. And if you didn't respect authority, what else might you disregard? Laws, tradition, the social ladder, the entire fabric of Tudor civilization? It was a slippery slope, at least in the Tudor imagination. There was also a practical element. The host or the ranking person often received the best and safest food. Lower-ranking people waited to ensure nothing poisoned the person at the top. This way, if the food was deadly, the problem conveniently resolved itself before it reached everyone else. A grim logic, but undeniably efficient. Timing also dictated the pace of the entire meal. Once your superior began to eat, you could begin, but that didn't mean you could eat freely. You were expected to match their pace, not too fast, lest you appear ravenous, not too slow, lest you imply the food was unworthy. Eating became a synchronized performance with the ranking diner as lead conductor and everyone else as terrified, hungry instrument sections hoping not to mess up. If the superior paused, you paused. Even if you had a juicy piece of meat halfway to your mouth, frozen mid-air like a tragic portrait of interrupted happiness. If they set their cup down, you mirrored the gesture. If they spent 10 minutes telling a story you'd heard 3 times already, every person at the table got 10 minutes of extra starvation. Because in Tudor England, meals operated on the theory that discipline made good citizens, and good citizens did not follow their stomachs. They followed their betters. But what made this rule especially punishing was that it extended to every level of society. Rich or poor, noble or common, someone above you always controlled when you ate. A farmer waited for the head of the household. Servants waited for the family. Apprentices waited for their master. Children waited for everyone, and often ended up finishing their meals in a state best described as emotionally supported by crumbs. It was a cascading pyramid of hunger, and every level of that pyramid reinforced obedience. Once the meal finally ended, because the superior decided it should, you didn't simply leave. You waited. You watched. You rose only when they rose, and you thanked them silently or loudly, depending on your rank, for permitting you the honour of not fainting at their table. The good news? You eventually ate. The bad news? Your stomach spent most of the meal negotiating its contract. If you ever wondered what Tudor England would think of modern people snacking straight from the kitchen counter, the answer is simple. They would faint, revive themselves just long enough to condemn you, and then faint a second time for emphasis. Because in the Tudor world, touching food before grace wasn't merely rude, it was a breach of cosmic order. Not only did it offend the household, but it signaled to everyone, present that you were willing to bypass God's approval for the sake of your stomach. And if you were bold enough to bypass God, what else were you willing to do? This was a society that took its table prayers more seriously than its dental hygiene, which is saying something considering the state of Tudor teeth. Grace was not optional. It was the opening ceremony of the meal, the spiritual equivalent of unlocking the door before entering a room. The idea was simple. Food came from God, and therefore God had to be acknowledged before anyone had the audacity to ingest it. But beneath this spiritual reasoning was a more strategic truth. Grace acted as a moment of forced unity and enforced discipline. The Tudors were a deeply hierarchical, deeply structured people, and meal prayers were just another lever to make sure everyone behaved properly. A typical Tudor meal began with everyone standing or bowing their heads while the head of the household, or sometimes a designated servant who had a decent memory and acceptable diction, recited grace. The prayer varied between households, but generally thanked God for the food, requested blessings on the household, and gently reminded diners that eating was not a right but a privilege granted by divine mercy. In other words, it was a reminder before every meal that you should be grateful for what lay before you, even if what lay before you was a suspicious stew of unknown origin and questionable texture. The rule against touching food early was absolute. No fingers, no knives, no rearranging your trencher for aesthetic purposes. No tapping at your cup as if to test its durability. Your hands rested calmly in your lap or on the edge of the table like obedient pets. Any premature interaction with food, even accidentally brushing a crust of bread, was interpreted as a sign of greed or impatience. In the Tudor worldview, hunger was a natural condition of life, but impatience was a flaw of the soul. And the scrutiny wasn't just internal, everyone at the table acted as an unofficial prayer enforcement squad. If you so much as twitched toward the platter before grace, at least 3 people would narrow their eyes, 2 would whisper, 1 would gasp loudly enough to make sure you noticed, and someone at the far end of the room who couldn't even see you clearly would simply assume you were up to no good. Nothing united a Tudor household like catching someone else breaking a rule. It's important to understand that prayer before meals was not, in their minds, simply about spiritual devotion. Not every Tudor was a model Christian, and not every Tudor dinner was a holy moment. Grace was performed because it maintained discipline. It reminded everyone, rich or poor, noble or common, that life was structured, ordered, and supervised by forces greater than themselves. The prayer inserted a pause between desire and fulfillment, making sure that everyone acknowledged the chain of command, God at the top, followed by the household's ranking members, and then everyone else. And this pause was strategic. In a world where social hierarchy was constantly reinforced through rituals, grace served as a moment where the highest ranking person in the room signaled the official start of the meal. Only after "Amen" echoed through the hall did the table come alive. Cups moved, bread was torn, meat was carved. It was as if the room collectively inhaled after holding its breath. The prayer was a release valve for hunger, but only after obedience had been demonstrated. There were even layers to how people behaved during the prayer. Nobles executed the ritual with slow, graceful motions, modest bowing, subtle hand placements, the elegant stillness of someone who was confident that God approved of them. Lower-ranking individuals, however, tended to show more pronounced signs of devotion, bowing deeper, holding themselves more rigidly, or closing their eyes with the intensity of someone hoping God wasn't paying too much attention to their last confession. Children, famously unable to sit still, were trained aggressively to respect the prayer. Parents treated grace as a miniature battlefield where the war was fought with sharp glances and whispered threats. A fidgeting child wasn't merely a distraction, they were a potential scandal. A child who grabbed a piece of bread before prayer wasn't indulging impulse. They were performing a public demonstration of parental failure. Servants had their own version of the ritual. While they often didn't dine with the family, they were expected to participate in grace quietly while serving. A servant reaching for a dish before the prayer was complete could be reprimanded for disrespecting both God and the household. And since servants were often positioned closest to the food during the prayer, resisting temptation was essentially a daily test of moral fortitude, one they passed with impressive consistency, considering the smells of Tudor cooking and the long hours of labour preceding each meal. What made this rule particularly powerful was how deeply it permeated daily life. Whether you were at a noble feast or a shepherd's cottage, whether you were eating roast venison or boiled turnips, whether the prayer was eloquent or barely intelligible, the ritual remained. Everything froze until the moment of blessing. Then, and only then, did the meal begin. So yes, in Tudor England the rule was clear. Touching food before grace wasn't bold, it was blasphemous. And if God didn't smite you for it, the people at your table would happily take over the job. The good news, once grace ended, the food was officially yours. The bad news, the surveillance wasn't. Before we dive in, let's set the scene. You walk into a Tudor dining hall carrying a fork, not a weapon, just a fork. Immediately, half the room assumes you're showing off, the other half assumes you're possessed by Italian demons, and at least one person wonders if this is how the world ends. Welcome to Tudor England, where forks were not the elegant companions of dining they are now. They were suspicious, foreign, untrustworthy gadgets that threatened everything the Tudors believed about food, morality, and good old-fashioned fingers. To modernise, the Tudor fear of forks seems charmingly ridiculous. But to understand their mistrust, you must understand what forks represented. They weren't just tools, they were symbols of foreign influence, unnecessary luxury, and a terrifying future in which eating might become cleaner, more refined, or even enjoyable, and the Tudors were not prepared for any of that. First, the foreignness of forks made them instantly problematic. Forks were associated with Italy and the Byzantine Empire, places Tudor England admired for their art but distrusted for their habits. Anything foreign came with baggage. The Tudors liked their traditions the way they liked their bread trenchers, heavy, durable, and unchanged for centuries. Introducing a fork into the dining ritual felt like introducing a scandal. It wasn't just new, it was too new. And anything too new carried the scent of moral decline. Some clergymen even argued that God gave humans fingers for eating, and therefore forks were an insult to divine design. If your hands worked perfectly well, and they did, why would you need a second set of metal fingers? The suspicion grew sharper when people realised that fork users didn't get their hands greasy. Not getting dirty was inherently suspicious in a world where cleanliness was more of a concept than a reality. People whispered that forks encouraged vanity and softness. They made eating too dainty, too graceful, and possibly too enjoyable. The Tudors equated virtue with discomfort. The idea of a utensil making life easier was practically a spiritual threat. If dinner became comfortable, what next? Cushioned benches, daily baths, civilization itself unravelling? Then there was the practical panic. Forks had 2 or 3 sharp tines, essentially tiny weapons. Imagine a nobleman glancing around a table where everyone is armed with mini pikes. Suddenly fingers seemed wonderfully safe. Until this point, the deadliest item at a Tudor dinner was a knife, and the Tudors had centuries of practice not stabbing the wrong person. Accidental stabbing still happened, but they were at least traditional. But adding another pointed object to the mix, chaos. Now consider the class implications. Forks were expensive, imported, exotic, and the wealthy people who adopted them early seemed to everyone else like they were flaunting their money on something as frivolous as a metal stick. The wealthy, in turn, felt superior for using them, which naturally offended everyone who didn't. Using a fork became a social statement. Look at me, I stab my food with a tiny sword because I can. And social statements in Tudor England were tightly controlled. Fingers, in contrast, were beautifully democratic. Everyone had them, everyone used them. There was no risk of showing off, no risk of offending God, and no risk of misinterpreting someone's intentions across the table. If your hand moved toward the roast, you were taking food. If your hand held a fork, who knew what evil lurked in your soul? But the real danger lay in how forks threatened established table manners. Tudor etiquette books were already dozens of chapters long, detailing how to tear meat properly, how to dip food in sauce without appearing gluttonous, how to avoid licking your fingers, a rule many failed at, and how to hold bread in a way that conveyed dignity. Forks overturned all of this. They changed movements. They altered gestures. They redefined what was polite. If forks became normal, then suddenly generations of etiquette training would become obsolete. The ability to carve meat with one hand while using bread as a stabilizer, a prized practice skill, would be useless. The artistry of keeping your left hand clean while doing everything else with your right would no longer matter. The Tudors weren't just resisting a utensil, they were resisting the collapse of their dining culture. Even those adventurous souls who dared to try forks often suffered socially. A man using a fork might be accused of affecting foreign airs. A woman might be judged as unnecessarily delicate. A noble might be mocked for choosing elegance over tradition. If someone used a fork awkwardly, and everyone used it awkwardly at first, they became the evening's entertainment. Look, he poked the meat and it flew across the knee. Foreign tools bring foreign disasters. In time, forks did gain acceptance, slowly, cautiously, the way the English adopt anything new. But during the Tudor period, they remained symbols of suspicion. Most people stuck firmly to the tradition of eating with fingers. Fingers the Tudors believed were not just practical, but morally superior. To eat with your hands meant you were grounded, honest and properly English. So yes, forks were objects of fear, judgment and whispered accusations. Fingers were safe, fingers were trusted, fingers were good enough for your ancestors, so they were good enough for you. And if your hands got greasy, well, that just showed character. The good news, you didn't need fancy equipment to survive dinner. The bad news, introducing a fork was the fastest way to become the meal's most suspicious guest. In Tudor England, bread wasn't just food. It was status. It was etiquette. It was a silent judge sitting on your plate, or rather forming your plate, waiting to expose exactly how civilized or uncivilized you were. While today bread is an innocent side item that people ignore until their meal arrives, in Tudor society, bread was a social barometer, a class indicator, and a moral test all rolled into one. If you didn't handle your bread properly, you didn't just embarrass yourself, you embarrassed your lineage. To understand the absurd importance of bread etiquette, you must first understand the trencher, a thick slab of day-old bread used as the plate. It was sturdy, absorbent, and absolutely ready to betray you if you didn't treat it with proper respect. People of higher rank received finer, whiter bread as trenchers. People of lower rank received darker, coarser bread that could, in desperate times, double as a building material. The whiter the bread, the closer you were to the top of society. The browner the bread, the closer you were to the bottom, both socially and nutritionally. But beyond its use as a plate, bread was also a test of your upbringing. You didn't just grab bread, you handled it with dignity. You tore it with the grace of a swan gliding across a lake, not with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't eaten since sunrise. Bread tearing was an art, and not everyone was talented. Rough tearing suggested impatience. Impatience suggested poor breeding. Poor breeding suggested moral weakness. And in Tudor logic, moral weakness suggested you might commit treason at any moment. This was not a world that enjoyed nuance. Proper bread etiquette required subtle precision. You didn't break off huge chunks like a starving peasant. You didn't gnaw at it like a dog. And you definitely didn't rip it in half with both hands as if reenacting a battle. Instead, you gently pinched small pieces from the edge, never the middle, which demonstrated restraint and refinement. Bread wasn't supposed to dominate the meal. It was a supporting actor, not the star. If your breadcrumbs scattered too widely, you were considered careless. If you left too few crumbs, you were too greedy. If you left too many, you were too fussy. A perfect Tudor diner left a delicate constellation of crumbs, just enough to show activity, not enough to show chaos. Then there were the trenchers themselves. These bread plates were designed to absorb juices from the meal. Gravy, sauce, grease, whatever fought its way across the table. but how you managed your trencher said everything about your class. If you were wealthy or noble, you usually didn't eat your trencher. Why? Because eating the thing your food sat on was considered a bit desperate. The trencher was beneath you, literally and symbolically. After the meal, wealthy households would give their used trenchers to the poor, the servants, or the dogs. Sometimes all three categories blended into one grateful audience. If you were lower class, however, the trencher was part of your meal. You ate it fully soaked, sometimes fully compromised, and you thanked fortune for the flavour. But, and this is important, you were still expected to eat it properly. No lifting the trencher and chomping into it like a rustic sandwich. You tore it gently, piece by piece, the same way the upper classes tore their cleaner bread. Even poverty had etiquette, and failing it was a social crime. The texture of bread also offered clues about your identity. Fine, white bread, manchet, signalled wealth. It required better flour, more refined milling and money. Coarse bread, maslin or rye, signalled modest means or agricultural realities. But beyond texture, people noticed how lightly or confidently you held the bread. A noble held bread delicately, fingers arched, showing mastery over their own appetite. A labourer held bread firmly because life required efficiency. A merchant held bread in a measured, thoughtful way because they occupied that middle ground where one wrong gesture could send them socially upward or downward. Bread etiquette could also reveal education. Tudor children were drilled relentlessly on how to handle their bread. Don't play with it. Don't crumble it nervously. Don't press it into shapes. Don't carve it into little figures. Don't dig your fingernail into it absent-mindedly. Bread misbehaviour was a direct reflection on your parents, and nothing made Tudor parents panic more than the possibility that dinner guests might discover their child behaving like a child. The rules extended further. Bread was not a napkin. Wiping your mouth with it was barbaric. Bread was not a sponge. Soaking up too much sauce was gluttony. Bread was not a tool. Using it to push food onto your knife was functional, but frowned upon if you performed the motion with too much enthusiasm. And there were unspoken spiritual associations as well. Bread had biblical symbolism. Treating it carelessly was seen as disrespectful. Not quite blasphemy, but certainly irreverent. In a world obsessed with demonstrating moral virtue, the last thing you wanted was someone whispering that you handled bread like a heathen. Even at large public feasts, where chaos threatened to overwhelm all sense of order, bread etiquette remained a quiet battlefield. Noble guests watched each other. Servants watched the nobles, children watched their parents, and everyone watched the person who inevitably tore their bread too aggressively and immediately became the subject of murmured commentary for the rest of the evening. At its core, Tudor bread etiquette functioned as a cultural mirror. It showed class, it showed discipline, it showed upbringing, it showed whether you knew how to behave under pressure while your stomach growled like an offended wolf. And of course it revealed whether you belonged. The good news, bread was always available. The bad news, it was always judging you. In Tudor England, dinner was not merely a meal, it was a soundscape, and not the pleasant kind with soft lute music and gentle conversation. No, it was at a battlefield of restraint where the enemy was any noise your mouth dared to produce. Slurping, chewing, gulping, smacking, any sound even vaguely connected to the act of staying alive could instantly transform you from an acceptable dinner guest into a walking cautionary tale. Tudor etiquette demanded silence from your lips, your throat, and preferably your entire digestive system. If they could have muted your stomach rumbling, they probably would have written a law for it. To fully appreciate Tudor noise discipline, you must understand that quietness was not simply politeness. It was proof of refinement. Sound was social evidence. A well-bred individual behaved like a statue with impeccable posture and absolutely no audible biological functions. A poorly bred person let their physical self intrude into the atmosphere. Noise at the table was treated with the same horror modern people reserve for someone replying all to a company-wide email. Chewing was the most policed of all. A Tudor diner was expected to chew slowly, closed-mouthed, and with the solemn concentration of a monk contemplating scripture. If someone heard you chew, Catastrophe. You might as well have stood on the table and declared anarchy. Hearing someone's food while they ate was considered one of the great social crimes of the period. A loud chew suggested impatience. Impatience suggested poor upbringing. Poor upbringing suggested moral weakness. And moral weakness suggested you were capable of, well, almost anything. In a society obsessed with outward signs of virtue, your molars had the potential to ruin you. Slurping was even worse. Soup and broth were common in Tudor diets, and both offered endless opportunities for disaster. A single slurp could echo across a hall like the horn of doom. People did not merely notice slurping, they felt personally attacked by it. A slurp suggested a lack of discipline, a lack of care, and a lack of respect for the sacred silence of dinner. If you made too much noise drinking broth, someone at the far end of the table would narrow their eyes and wonder aloud, were they raised in the wild? Even the act of swallowing had expectations. A delicate sip was admired. A noticeable gulp meant you were either too thirsty, too eager, or too alive, all of which were frowned upon. Any sound resembling a glug, gulp, or ah placed your entire reputation under review. The Tudors believed that a refined person drank quietly and breathed quietly and, ideally, existed quietly. This obsession with silence didn't come from nowhere. Noise was considered one of the clearest indicators of self-control. The ability to mask the messy reality of eating meant you could also mask your emotions, your impulses, and your flaws. If you could discipline your jaw, society assumed you could discipline the rest of your character. Noise discipline also helped protect the fragile dignity of elite dining. After all, Tudor meals involved heavy foods, heavy sauces, heavy trenchers, heavy everything. Eating them quietly required skill. You had to time your bites with the flow of conversation. You had to suppress coughs. You had to chew each piece to perfection before swallowing. And if you needed to clear your throat, you prayed your soul would leave your body before you disgraced your lineage with a sound. The consequences for breaking these rules were severe, not legally, but socially. A single noisy chew could become the story of the night. If the wrong person heard your slurp, the tale travelled faster than a royal scandal. "Did you hear him?" someone would whisper. "He slurped his pottage like he's never seen a spoon." By the next morning the retelling would grow. He slurped 3 times. By the end of the week, he slurped continuously from the moment he sat down. Monstrous. Reputation decay in Tudor England didn't require a crime, just a loud mouth. And make no mistake, people were listening. Everyone at the table maintained finely tuned ears trained to detect even the faintest breach of decorum. A noble woman might pretend to be engrossed in conversation, but she was absolutely monitoring the sound waves around her. A servant carrying a platter would not dare breathe too loudly, let alone swallow. Children quickly learned that their natural instinct to chew like a happy creature would be met with a sharp look that translated to silence or exile. The fear of noise had other effects too. People ate differently. They took smaller bites, they chewed slower, they drank cautiously. Meals extended longer than necessary because everyone was tiptoeing around the possibility of making a sound. When dining with individuals of higher rank, the stress doubled. You weren't just eating, you were performing a moral opera with your mouth sealed shut. Even the architecture of Tudor halls amplified this pressure. Large, echoing rooms made even the smallest mistake sound like a declaration. A single misplaced gulp could bounce off stone walls and suddenly feel like a confession shouted from the rooftops. In smaller homes where people sat closer together, the danger was even greater. There was no space to hide the sound of your swallow, no corner to disguise a quiet cough, no safe region of the table where noise could be blamed on someone else. In truth, surviving a Tudor meal silently was a skill. It was discipline, it was strategy, it was self-preservation, and it was exhausting. The good news? You could eat without noise. The bad news? You had to chew like a ghost auditioning for sainthood. If you've ever eaten something so delicious that you instinctively licked your fingers, congratulations, you would not have survived 5 minutes in Tudor society. In the Tudor world, licking your fingers at the table wasn't a small lapse in manners. It wasn't even mild embarrassment. It was a social catastrophe, the kind of faux pas that made people stare at you as if you had just declared peasants should vote. Because in Tudor England, how you managed your hands revealed everything about your character, and licking them revealed far too much. Let's start with the obvious. Tudor meals were messy. This was a world before forks became respectable, before napkins were standard, before individual plates made sense to people. Food was oily, juicy, saucy, and often carved or torn by hand. You were going to get messy. Everyone knew it. But the question wasn't whether your fingers got dirty, it was what you did next. A well-bred Tudor diner pretended not to notice their own sticky fingers. They calmly wiped them on a cloth if one was available, or subtly used a piece of bread to clean them. They maintained composure, pretending that nothing as humiliating as grease had ever touched their skin. Their restraint demonstrated refinement, discipline, and command of their animal impulses. A poorly bred Tudor diner licked their fingers. This one action, this tiny, nearly invisible instinct, was a disaster. It implied pleasure. It implied indulgence. It implied, worst of all, an uncontrolled desire to enjoy your food. And enjoyment in a Tudor worldview obsessed with self-control was suspicious at best and sinful at worst. Finger-licking signalled lack of restraint, and restraint was a moral currency. You were expected to show that you could resist temptation, even the temptation of gravy on your own hand. A person who licked their fingers was basically confessing, yes, I surrender to flavour. And that simply wouldn't do. There was a deeper reason for this panic. Finger-licking blurred the line between civilised eating and primal eating. The Tudors lived in fear of appearing animalistic. Any gesture that reminded people of wildness, excessive chewing, loud noises, visible hunger, was considered degrading. Licking your fingers? That was practically a performance of instinct. You might as well howl at the moon for dessert. Now, you might ask, why didn't they use napkins? Oh, Wealthier households had linen cloths, but they were used sparingly to avoid looking wasteful. Lower classes used the hem of their sleeve, which they pretended was socially acceptable. Some wiped their hands on scraps of bread, a technique known as the bread napkin, which simultaneously cleaned your fingers and quietly disposed of evidence that you nearly lost control. But the one thing no one, under any circumstance, was supposed to do was bring any individual finger toward the mouth. Even the motion alone, the gentle curve of the hand, the slight tilt of the wrist, could send shockwaves down the table. It wasn't just inappropriate, it was intimate. The Tudors believed the body should remain modest at all times, including during meals. Touching your mouth with your fingers was seen as a private act, something that belonged in the quiet privacy of washing up, not displayed in front of an entire hall filled with judgmental eyes. And those eyes were always watching. People at Tudor tables were trained observers. They monitored other diners the way modern audiences watch reality shows, with fascination, suspicion, and a deep desire to witness a mistake. If someone licked their fingers even once, the room took note. It didn't matter if you were otherwise refined. You could have chewed with perfect silence, held your bread like royalty, and waited for grace like a saint. One finger lick erased all your previous accomplishments. Whispers would spread like wildfire. He licked his fingers. During the meal? During the meal! With enthusiasm? The worst kind. By the end of the night, your identity was reduced to a single characteristic, finger licker, and the Tudors loved attaching permanent labels to people. In a society where reputation mattered more than comfort, being associated with undisciplined dining habits could follow you for years. You might get fewer invitations, people might seat you farther from the host. Someone might even warn their children, sit properly, or you'll turn out like that man who licked his fingers during the Michaelmas Feast of 92. Even more interesting is the irony. Tudor food was often seasoned, sauced, and flavourful, especially at noble meals. Some dishes were designed to be eaten with fingers. because that's simply how the culture functioned. Yet the act of enjoying that flavour too visibly was forbidden. You could savour the dish, but you had to savour it discreetly, internally, silently. Pleasure was allowed, visible pleasure was not. There was a practical angle too. Licking your fingers risked spreading germs at a table where most people shared dishes, cups, or serving tools. Although the Tudors didn't understand microbiology, they did understand that someone putting their spit-covered hands back into communal food was deeply revolting. So finger-licking wasn't just socially suspect, it was considered unhygienic even by people who thought bathing monthly was ambitious. The anxiety around finger cleanliness extended far beyond the moment of eating. A respectable diner constantly monitored their hands. Were they clean enough? Dry. Enough? Too shiny with oil? Too bold with sauce? Your fingers told a story, and you needed that story to be the tale of a calm, virtuous, controlled individual, someone who ate like a refined human being, not a gleeful animal discovering roast venison for the first time. So in the end, Tudor society's rule was firm. Eat with your hands if you must. Most people did, but never show enjoyment, never show hunger, and absolutely never show enthusiasm. The good news? The food was delicious. The bad news? You weren't allowed to look like you thought so. In Tudor England, alcohol wasn't a treat. It was a necessity. Water was often unsafe, milk was unpredictable, and fruit juice was a luxury for people who had more orchards than problems. That left ale, beer and wine as the liquid foundations of everyday life. But just because alcohol flowed freely didn't mean you were free to drink freely. In fact, of all the table behaviours the Tudors feared, drinking too much was the one that turned dinner from a polite social ritual into a high-stakes moral test. Everyone had a cup, everyone had access, but only the disciplined survived with their dignity intact. To understand why drinking mattered so much, you must understand what Tudor society valued most at the table: self-control. A sober Tudor was a respectable Tudor, someone who embodied virtue through steady hands, measured speech, and the ability to remain upright throughout an entire meal. But a drunk Tudor, that was a walking disaster. Excessive drinking didn't simply signal poor manners, it indicated a collapse of character, a threat to social order, and an invitation for people to whisper about you for weeks. The Tudors treated drunkenness like a moral contagion. One person getting drunk didn't just embarrass themselves. They embarrassed the entire table, the host, their family, their lineage, and anyone who ever taught them anything about manners. Drinking too much wasn't a private misstep, it was a public crisis, and everyone watched for the signs. The first danger was slurred speech. In a society that prized calm, polite conversation, even the slightest wobble in your voice could betray you. If your words began to drift, grow louder, or, heaven forbid, become enthusiastic, listeners narrowed their eyes. Is he enjoying himself? They wondered. Enjoyment was suspicious. Loud enjoyment was proof of intoxication. Then came the physical signs. The overconfident lean toward the person next to you, the slightly delayed reaction to a joke, the sudden belief that you were charming. The Tudors interpreted these behaviours not as human nature, but as moral fog slipping in through your cup. And because meals were long and drinks were refilled often, the pressure to pace yourself was immense. But why such severity? Because Tudor society linked sobriety to respectability. A sober person had control over themselves. A sober person kept secrets, navigated politics, managed emotions, and avoided scandal. Alcohol threatened all of that. A drunk person might speak too honestly or too boldly. They might forget their place. They might challenge someone unintentionally with a joke or a gesture. They might, even worse, touch the tableware incorrectly. Drunkenness made people unpredictable, and unpredictability terrified a society built on order. A drunk guest didn't just risk embarrassment, they risked accusations of disrespect, insubordination, or even treason, depending on whose toes they stumbled onto. Social hierarchies were fragile, and one wobbling drinker could topple an evening's stability faster than a spilled cup. Hosts feared drunkenness most of all. A guest who drank too much reflected poorly on the entire household. If a nobleman allowed his guest to overindulge, it suggested he couldn't maintain discipline. If a merchant overserved someone, it hinted at poor judgment. If a common household lost control of its drinking, it signalled chaos. The Tudors believed that a well-run table required moderation from every participant, and so hosts monitored drinking closely. They noticed who refilled their cup too quickly. They noticed who took frequent sips. They noticed who stared too lovingly at the ale pitcher. Even servants were trained to watch for the signs. A servant might be instructed to slow down their pouring, move the jug away, or claim the supply had run out, all socially acceptable ways to save a guest from their own downfall. The consequences of failing to stop drinking in time were brutal. You might laugh too loudly, you might knock over a cup, you might forget to use the proper hand when eating. You might, horror of horrors, interrupt someone of higher rank. A single misstep committed under the influence could stain your reputation permanently. He drank too much during the winter feast, people would whisper years later. No discipline, no restraint. A lifetime of polite behaviour could crumble in one evening, undone by a single cup too many. There were more physical dangers too. Tudor halls were full of candles, tapestries, tight spaces and uneven floors. A drunk person weaving through them was a fire hazard, a tripping hazard, and an emotional hazard. Falling into the fire was considered a very real possibility. So was falling onto the host. Neither outcome was socially survivable. Worse still, Tudor cities had strict laws about public drunkenness. Leaving a feast intoxicated could result in fines or a stay in the stocks. Many hosts took responsibility for ensuring their guests left sober enough to avoid legal trouble. Not because they were kind, but because an arrested guest reflected poorly on them. Nothing said poor household management like someone staggering out of your door and into an officer's arms. But the greatest danger of all was talking too openly. Alcohol loosened tongues. And in Tudor society, loose tongues were deadly. You might make a joke about someone's outfit, or reveal a rumour you overheard, or worst of all, make a comment about the monarch that sounded slightly less worshipful than absolute devotion. One stray remark could be twisted into sedition, and the Tudors loved accusing people of sedition. Drinking too much wasn't just embarrassing, it was politically reckless. So yes, drinking at the table was allowed, but drinking too much? That was a gamble with your reputation, your social standing, and in some cases, your neck. The good news? A little drink smoothed the edges of Tudor life. The bad news? A little too much made you the evening's cautionary tale. If you thought the Tudors were done policing your every muscle after all the rules about silence, posture, timing, and finger purity, oh no. Now we arrive at one of the most surprisingly complex and secretly perilous elements of Tudor dining: passing food. In a modern meal, you hand the potatoes to whoever says, "Could you pass the potatoes?" In Tudor England, that kind of spontaneous generosity was how reputations died. Because the Tudors did not simply pass dishes, they upheld a strict, socially encoded flow of movement. Plates didn't just travel, they travelled correctly. And passing food the wrong way wasn't a faux pas, it was a political misstep. At the heart of the Tudor serving protocol was the belief that food should move according to hierarchy, not convenience. Dishes were not shared in a circle or handed across like friendly offerings. They moved in one direction, one table at a time, obeying a system that mirrored the social structure of the entire kingdom. If society had a spine, this was it. Picture the dining hall. The high table sits elevated, the place where power resides. Below it stretch rows of lower tables arranged by a rank. Food originates near the highest ranking person. This is no accident. Food, like authority, was meant to descend, not circulate freely. It flowed downward in predetermined lanes, one dignified pass at a time. If you passed food upward towards someone more important than you had just committed the dinner equivalent of climbing onto the royal throne. The unspoken rule was simple: always pass to your social equal or lower, never to someone above you. Why? Because offering something upward suggested you had something those above you did not. An implication so socially dangerous that even the roast it the elf seemed to tremble at the idea. Passing upward inverted the natural order. It implied your hands held authority they were never meant to possess. The direction of movement wasn't just vertical, it was horizontal too. Most households enforced a specific passing direction, usually to the right, the proper direction, though some estates observed traditions that required passing left. It depended on region, household custom, and how aggressively the head of the house wanted to enforce control, but whichever direction applied, you followed it. You did not improvise. Improvisation was chaos, and Tudor dining feared chaos more than plague, which they believed they could solve with herbs and prayer. Breaking the directional rule triggered instant alarm among the table's more attentive observers. A dish passed left in a right-passing household caused heads to turn, eyebrows to lift, and someone, always someone, to mentally note, uncultured. If the dish travelled the wrong way twice, dangerously uncultured, 3 times, possibly criminal. There was also the question of who touched the dish first. The highest-ranking diner received first rights not because they were hungry, though some probably were, but because the food served as a visible symbol of their superiority. If someone lower touched the platter first, accidentally or intentionally, it wasn't just rude. It was interpreted as a power grab. It suggested presumption, ambition, perhaps treasonous greed. One wrong reach and suddenly you were the one who thought he outranked Sir Thomas. Even the act of handing someone a dish was ritualized. You didn't hold it out casually. You supported it in both hands if it was large, in one hand if it was small, and never at an angle that allowed sauce to slosh. Sloshing sauce across the table was the social equivalent of firing a cannon into the dining room. A Tudor's table was orderly, controlled, mathematically precise. One slosh and the illusion shattered. Then came the matter of eye contact. Making eye contact while passing a dish upward was presumptuous. Avoiding eye contact while passing a dish downward was dismissive. And staring directly at someone while holding a platter, even for a second too long, risked implying challenge, flirtation, rivalry, or judgment, none of which were safe during dinner. People practiced the correct amount of eye contact the way modern actors rehearse lines, carefully, intentionally, and with fear. But the most fascinating part of Tudor passing protocol is how deeply it reinforced hierarchy. Passing always began with the host or the most important guest. Dishes moved outward from this figure like ripples in a pond. To be offered food early was an honour. To receive it late was a reminder of your place. And no one complained. Complaining about your position in the passing order was like complaining about being lower in society. It was both futile and socially fatal. A diner not only needed to know their place in the order, they needed to know everyone else's. Misidentifying rank could lead to disaster. Imagine handing a platter to someone thinking they outranked you, only to discover they were beneath you. Suddenly you'd performed humility in the wrong direction, and humility misdirected wasn't humility at all, it was confusion. And confusion implied you didn't understand the social world, which made everyone uncomfortable. Even servants adhered to strict rules. A servant didn't pass a dish across a noble's body. A servant didn't hand a dish directly into a noble's hand unless instructed. A servant placed dishes with mechanical precision at the correct angle and distance. Servants were not simply waitstaff, they were custodians of order. If they made a mistake, diners assumed it reflected the household's discipline. Everything in Tudor society, even the passing of a platter, reflected someone's virtue or someone's failure. Large feasts amplified these rules. With dozens or even hundreds of guests, passing protocol transformed into an elaborate dance of trays, hands, and glances. Food travelled like a procession, never pausing too long, never veering off course. If someone disrupted the flow, say by passing incorrectly, they risked derailing an entire table's rhythm. And once a table lost its rhythm, the disorder spread like panic through the hall. The Tudors were not good at improvisation. They wanted structure. They needed it. Without structure, they feared dinner might devolve into chaos, rebellion, or worse, enthusiasm. So yes, passing food the wrong way was dangerous. Not physically, but socially. It signalled ignorance, imprudence, disrespect, and possibly ambition. It broke the invisible chain linking each diner to their proper place. The good news, you eventually received your food. The bad news, you had to navigate a social obstacle course just to get it. In Tudor England, food might have looked communal, great platters piled high, trenchers overflowing, servants weaving between benches with dishes the size of shields. But don't let the abundance fool you. Sharing was not a natural right. It was a regulated privilege. You didn't simply reach over and offer someone a slice of roasted venison because it looked like they wanted it. And you certainly didn't take something from another person's portion unless you wanted to be the talk of the hall for all the wrong reasons. Sharing required permission. Generosity needed authorization. One wrong gesture with your hand, and suddenly you weren't helpful, you were socially dangerous. The Tudors believed deeply in the concept of ownership at the table, a strange idea in a society that often served dishes communally. But this ownership wasn't based on quantity. It was based on hierarchy. As soon as a platter arrived in front of the highest-ranking person, that person didn't just receive food, they received control of the food. Permission flowed from them downward like everything else in Tudor life. If they decided to offer a slice of something to someone, it was generous. If someone else made the same offer, it was presumptuous. Generosity wasn't about kindness, it was about remembering your rank and acting within it. Food, like power, had to be distributed in the correct direction. Imagine a scene. You notice your neighbour hasn't gotten a piece of eel pie yet. The modern reaction? Offer them one. The Tudor reaction? Sit absolutely still and pretend you haven't noticed. Only if. The host indicated approval, perhaps with a subtle nod. Could you perform this tiny act of human decency? Without that nod, offering food was considered meddling. It suggested you were taking on a role that wasn't yours. Helping someone eat without permission was like rearranging the church pews because you felt the layout could be better. Taking food voluntarily from someone else's plate or trencher was an even greater crime. It wasn't playful, it wasn't friendly. It was a signal that you didn't understand boundaries. In a world built entirely on boundaries, that made you a liability. Stealing a bite could mark you as greedy, untrained, or worse, someone who didn't respect ownership. The Tudors judged character through small gestures, and nothing revealed poor character faster than acting like someone else's portion was free real estate. This rule wasn't just for nobles. Even in humble households, people respected ownership at the table. A loaf of bread placed in the centre belonged to everyone, but a piece torn off and set near someone's trencher belonged to that person alone. A slab of pork placed in front of the head of the household belonged first to him, and the distribution that followed happened on his terms. Children learned early, hands to yourself unless told otherwise. Servants played a complicated role in this system. They handled the food, carried it, placed it, but they were never to assume authority over it. A servant didn't decide who got what portion. They followed commands. If a servant accidentally handed the best cut of meat to someone lower in status, it wasn't the diner who was scolded. It was the servant who had dared to disrupt the order. A misdirected serving was interpreted as an insult. Who was this servant to redistribute privilege? Even the smallest acts of sharing carried social implications. If a high-ranking person took food from their own plate and offered it to someone else, it was a gesture of honour. It meant, I acknowledge you. Receiving food directly from a superior's hand could elevate your standing for the entire evening. But if you attempted to reverse this gesture, offering something from your plate to a superior, you implied that they needed you. And no Tudor superior ever needed anything from someone below them. Sharing among equals was more flexible, but even then it required delicacy. You didn't shove a dish toward someone, You didn't push your trencher closer to their side. You carefully offered the choice, and they carefully declined or accepted, because even equals had to navigate the minefield of appearing too eager or too generous. Generosity, if excessive, looked like showing off. Food shortages made things even more sensitive. In poorer households, portions were small. Sharing became an unspoken sacrifice, and because the Tudors believed strongly in duty, that sacrifice needed to be acknowledged. But again, only within proper channels. A mother could give food to a child without scandal. A husband could give to his wife. A neighbour could offer something to another neighbour, but only if invited to. Hunger did not override hierarchy. Within noble feasts, where abundance seemed endless, these rules became even stricter. People watched who shared with whom, because sharing was a form of alliance. If one noble subtly offered another a delicacy, the room took note. It might signal friendship, negotiation, debt, favour, or flirtation. One misplaced plum, one incorrectly offered piece of roast, and suddenly rumours blossomed. The Tudors had no social media, but they had biz. And gossip at a feast moved faster than anything printed on paper. Children faced particularly harsh scrutiny. A child reaching for someone else's food without permission was an educational emergency. Parents reacted instantly, with sharp looks and whispered commands, because a child who couldn't respect ownership at the table was a sign of failed upbringing, and failed upbringing reflected on the entire household. The consequences for breaking the sharing rule were subtle but brutal. You weren't punished physically, but you were marked. People remembered. You were labelled overeager, greedy, or undisciplined. You might find yourself seated farther away from the host next time. Invitations might grow scarce, and worst of all, whispers might circulate. He shares food like a man who doesn't know his place. The good news? You eventually got your portion. The bad news? You had no right to offer or accept anything else without permission. In Tudor England, where every movement at the table carried political weight, nothing was more dangerous or revealing than reaching across the well. Today, reaching for the salt without asking might earn you a mild glare. In Tudor society, it could earn you a reputation. The Tudors believed deeply in boundaries, personal, social, territorial, and the dining table was one of the strictest arenas where all of these collided. When someone reached across the table, they weren't just extending an arm, they were extending their influence. And in a culture obsessed with hierarchy, that was a bold, unsettling move. To understand why this mattered so much, you must first picture the Tudor table as the Tudors themselves saw it, a map of the social world. Every seat represented rank, every trencher represented ownership, every platter represented controlled privilege. And the empty space between these things was not empty at all. It was charged, silent territory. The area in front of you was yours, the area in front of someone else was theirs, and the space in between belonged to the invisible rules everyone was expected to follow. Reaching into someone else's territory, even for a split second, meant you believed you had the right to cross boundaries. And the Tudors were very clear about one thing. Most people did not have that right. A person of high rank rarely had to reach for anything. Food and drink flowed toward them like obedient streams. Servants anticipated their needs before they needed to lift a finger. Lower-ranking guests were expected to pass dishes respectfully in the proper direction, as you learned in the last chapter, meaning a noble rarely touched anything beyond their own personal space. Therefore, if a noble did reach for something, it wasn't out of necessity, it was out of choice, a deliberate choice, a message. But when someone lower reached, entirely different story. Reaching suggested impatience. Impatience suggested entitlement. Entitlement suggested ambition. And ambition, particularly the kind that ignored boundaries, was a dangerous signal in Tudor society. A person who reached might reach again, metaphorically, into territory they didn't belong, a political role, a social group, a conversation of their betters, or even an inheritance dispute. The Tudors were excellent at connecting dots that didn't belong together. The act itself was full of perilous details. Did your elbow lift too high? That showed boldness. Did your sleeve brush the table? That showed carelessness. Did your hand hover too long over someone else's dish? That showed greed. Did you accidentally touch someone else's trencher? That showed either blatant disrespect or astonishing ignorance. Even reaching for something directly in front of you required finesse. You kept your elbow tight to your torso. You extended only the amount necessary. You moved with the smooth, unobtrusive precision of someone who wanted to take up less space, not more. If reaching within your own territory required grace, reaching beyond it required, well, ideally, restraint so strong that you simply didn't do it. If the item you wanted sat out of your reach, the polite option was to ask someone closer to pass it. But asking came with its own social math. You had to ask someone of equal or lower rank. You had to phrase it humbly. You had to time it so you didn't interrupt the host or draw attention to yourself. You had to ensure your request didn't imply impatience or criticism of the person currently in control of the dish. Asking could be awkward, but reaching was worse. Therefore, the safest path was often to do nothing and accept whatever food eventually arrived in its proper sequence. Hunger healed, reputation did not, but reaching did happen, usually by people who either didn't understand the rules, didn't fear them, or didn't care about the consequences. When this happened, the entire table noticed. Even people at the far end who couldn't see the action clearly felt the disturbance. It wasn't the reach itself that shocked them. It was the psychology behind it. Reaching boldly across the table signaled dominance. It signaled confidence. It signaled disregard for territorial rules. In some contexts, this was threatening. In others, it was strangely admirable. A powerful noble might reach across the table to take something because they could, because they were untouchable, because breaking the rules proved their place above them. Everyone else had to obey etiquette. They were etiquette's exception. In contrast, when someone lower did it, the room gasped internally. It indicated a person who did not understand their limitations, or worse, a person who did understand them and chose to ignore them. Tudor society didn't forgive people who overestimated themselves. Ambition was tolerated when hidden. Reaching made it visible. Women faced particularly strict rules about this. A woman reaching over the table risked being labelled bold, forward, or lacking modesty, 3 qualities Tudor society despised in a respectable woman. A man might get away with reaching once. A woman would be judged for it for seasons. Children, of course, were the worst offenders. Their small arms darted out impulsively toward whatever looked appealing. Parents, mortified, reacted instantly. A Tudor dinner table was one of the fastest environments in history for teaching a child the importance of boundaries. One wrong reach, and the family's reputation trembled. Parents clamped little hands to laps, whispering warnings through clenched teeth. In noble courts, reaching had political implications too. Imagine a banquet where powerful figures sat shoulder to shoulder. If a courtier reached across the table, especially in front of someone higher ranking, it could be interpreted as an insult, a challenge, or even a gesture of subtle defiance. Reaching became a silent language. It said things words could not say safely. Even servants had rules. A servant placing a dish had to lean, not reach. They kept their movements tight, controlled, invisible. A servant reaching directly in front of a noble guest without permission wasn't just rude, it was unacceptable. Servants learned to navigate physical space like dancers, gliding around territorial boundaries that might as well have been walls. And what happened when someone violated the rule? Nothing and everything. No one shouted, no one scolded. But the silence shifted, the air stiffened. People exchanged tiny looks. A seed was planted. That person doesn't understand their place. And once planted, that seed grew. The Tudors didn't need laws to keep people in place. They had space. And everyone knew space was sacred. The good news? Staying within your boundaries kept you safe. The bad news? Your elbows never got to be free. In Tudor England, desire was dangerous, and nothing revealed desire faster than your hand drifting toward the best piece of food on the table. Whether it was the choicest slice of roasted beef, the crispiest wing of a goose, the softest interior of a freshly baked manchette loaf, or the one perfectly browned trencher that hadn't absorbed too much gravy, reaching for the best portion was one of the most socially destructive acts you could commit during a meal. Wanting it was already questionable. Taking it? That was practically a confession of moral failure. To modern diners, choosing the best piece is common sense. You take the piece that looks good. You paid for it after all. But Tudor dining wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about appetite. It certainly wasn't about enjoyment. Tudor meals were rituals of deference, public demonstrations of where you stood in the social hierarchy and how well you understood your place. And one of the clearest ways to demonstrate obedience was to pretend that the best piece didn't exist. The Tudors believed that the right to eat the finest portion belonged only to the highest-ranking person at the table, and that person didn't have to reach for it. The dish was presented in front of them first. They had both the privilege of choice and the privilege of hesitation. They might pick the superior piece. They might select a smaller one to appear humble. Either way, they dictated the tone of the entire meal. Everyone else watched. Everyone else waited. Everyone else adjusted their choices accordingly. Your own role was simple: never eat above your rank. And selecting the good piece, even accidentally, sent all the wrong messages. It suggested you believed your hunger mattered. Worse, it suggested you believed your opinion mattered. In Tudor logic, both ideas were hazardous. The danger began the moment a dish arrived. Platters were placed strategically so that the highest-ranking person could take their portion first. After that, the plate moved down the line, offering increasingly less impressive options. This was by design. The serving order turned the dish itself into a visual metaphor for social rank. The best went first, the adequate came later, and the questionable scraps were for those who had no business complaining. When the platter finally reached you, perhaps containing a piece that still looked somewhat edible, your task was to choose modestly. You didn't hover, you didn't inspect, you didn't flip pieces over like a treasure hunter assessing loot quality. You chose the humbler piece, the smaller one, the slightly overcooked one, the one with a suspiciously crispy corner, and you accepted it with gratitude. Selecting the inferior piece wasn't merely etiquette, it was self-denial as a public performance. It showed that you placed social order above appetite, that you valued discipline over desire, and that you accepted your position in the grand chain of Tudor existence. Taking the worst piece was a way of saying, I understand the universe. And understanding the universe was very fashionable in Tudor society. But what if you did reach for the good piece? What if hunger, greed, or the simple human instinct for pleasure overruled your training? Then you created a ripple. People noticed instantly. The Tudors had a supernatural talent for detecting impropriety. They could spot a transgressive reach at distances previously unknown to humankind. The person seated next to you would stiffen. Someone across the table would raise an eyebrow. A murmur might spread, soft, subtle, devastating. You wouldn't be confronted. That wasn't the Tudor way. Instead, you would become a topic of whispered conversation after the meal. He took the goose's best wing. He showed no shame. Imagine the boldness. How can he be trusted if he can't control his hunger? Because that was the real fear. If you couldn't regulate your appetite, how could you regulate your ambition? If you took the best piece today, what might you take tomorrow? A higher seat? A better position? A noblewoman's attention? A political role? Tudor society linked appetite to morality. If your stomach was unruly, so was your soul. This rule extended beyond meat. At noble feasts, the best didn't always mean the tastiest. It meant the rarest. Imported fruits, sugared almonds, sweetmeats, marzipan sculptures, or delicate pastries were considered luxuries meant for the elite. If you dared to touch those items before someone above you, the offence was doubled: inappropriate desire and inappropriate privilege. Even in modest households, the system persisted. A father received the choicest piece, then perhaps the eldest son, then other family members. If a child grabbed the best cut, parents reacted with alarm typically reserved for disasters. A hand was slapped away, a stern whisper followed. Even the youngest Tudor children learned early that desire was something to be kept hidden, not indulged in plain sight. Then there were guests. Offering a guest the best piece was an honour. Accepting it was a delicate dance. You had to accept graciously but not eagerly. If you hesitated too long, you appeared falsely modest. If you accepted too quickly, you seemed greedy. Navigating the moment required the balance of a tightrope walker. Servants too needed to understand portion hierarchy. When presenting a dish, they angled it toward the highest-ranking diner. If they accidentally presented the best piece to someone lower, it reflected poorly on the household's discipline. A single misplaced platter could imply that the household didn't understand rank, an accusation more humiliating than a poorly cooked meal. In short, choosing the best piece wasn't simply a dining mistake, it was a social challenge, intentional or not. It upset the entire symbolic structure of the table. It made visible what should remain concealed, that deep down, all humans want the good piece. But Tudors believed that wanting the good piece proved you didn't deserve it. The good news, humility earned respect. The bad news, your appetite was none of your business. In Tudor England, the act of eating wasn't simply nourishment, it was choreography. A silent dance performed in real time, where every movement conveyed judgment about your upbringing, self-control and inner moral architecture. And in this dance, pace was everything. Eating too slowly made you suspicious. Eating too quickly made you disgraceful. Moderation wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Timing didn't just reflect appetite, timing was character. To understand why the Tudors cared so deeply about pace, you must recognize their obsession with visible self-control. Everything about a person, how they walked, how they bowed, how they chewed, how long they waited, served as a public declaration of discipline. A Tudor meal was a stage where you performed your ability to restrain yourself, and nowhere was this more obvious than in the speed with which you ate your food. Eat too fast and people assumed you were greedy. Greed meant weakness. Weakness meant lack of breeding, and lack of breeding suggested all sorts of other deficiencies, including the terrifying possibility that you had not been properly trained. A fast eater was viewed as someone unable to resist the base instincts of hunger, someone who revealed too much about themselves through the simple violence of speed. Eat too slowly, however, and people drew a completely different set of damning conclusions. Slow eating suggested that you were overly cautious, affected, or even manipulative, someone who performed modesty with theatrical exaggeration. Too slow meant pretending to be delicate. Too slow meant calling attention to yourself. Too slow meant acting above your station by trying to appear refined beyond what your rank entitled you to display. Thus, you walked a narrow path. Eat at just the right pace. Not rushed, not hesitant, but perfectly calibrated. You were expected to match the general rhythm of the table, especially the rhythm set by the highest-ranking diner. If they ate quickly, you adapted. If they lingered on each piece, you followed suit. Your pace wasn't your own. It was a reflection of the hierarchy around you. This synchronization served multiple functions. It ensured that no one finished long before anyone else, which would have created awkward power imbalances, the Tudor equivalent of finishing a group project in 5 minutes while everyone else was still panicking. And it prevented anyone from lagging behind so much that they forced the table to wait for them, creating the impression that they believed their time mattered more than the group's. But it was more than etiquette. It was moral performance. The Tudors believed that anyone who ate at the correct pace demonstrated a balanced soul. They were not controlled by hunger. They were not controlled by pride. They existed in a perfect internal harmony that the Tudors valued more than comfort. A properly paced eater had conquered their impulses, their haste, their laziness, and their desire. Imagine the pressure. You sit at the table, surrounded by watchful eyes, aware that your chewing rhythm communicates your entire personality. You lift a piece of venison. Do you bite too fast? Do you pause too long? Do you look too eager? Do you look bored? Are you chewing too much? Too little? Is the pace of your knife consistent? Are your hands too still? Does your timing mimic the master of the household, or does it betray an independent streak the Tudors would view with suspicion? Even chewing speed was a factor. Chew too rapidly and people saw desperation. Chew too slowly and they saw pretension. Chew at an inconsistent pace and they saw instability. In Tudor dining, it wasn't enough to chew silently. You had to chew responsibly. The pace expectations grew even more complicated when dealing with multiple courses. Meals often progressed from savoury dishes to sweet ones, and you were expected to shift your eating rhythm subtly with each change, never rushing toward the sweets, too childish, and never lingering too long on the meats, too indulgent. Pudding enthusiasm was a particularly dangerous giveaway. A diner who showed visible excitement for sugar risked becoming the evening's whispered entertainment. Children faced especially harsh pace training. Parents drilled them relentlessly, forcing them to eat at the proper speed regardless of hunger or mood. A child who ate too slowly was scolded for vanity. A child who ate too quickly was scolded for savagery. The ideal Tudor child ate at a moderate, dignified pace that matched the adults, not because it was natural, but because it signalled successful parenting. A child eating too slowly or too fast made adults look incompetent, which in Tudor society was unforgivable. Servants also had pace expectations, though of a different kind. They did not eat with the household, but when they did eat, usually after serving everyone else, they were expected to eat quickly enough not to appear idle, but not so quickly that they seemed desperate. Their eating pace was judged too. Fast meant greed, slow meant laziness. Even in the servants' hall, timing mattered. What made all of this so exhausting was the fact that no written guide explained the exact right speed. You learned it through observation, experience, and fear. The right pace shifted depending on the company, the setting, the occasion, and the rank of the diners. A feast had one rhythm, a private meal had another. Eating with nobility required extra caution. Eating with royalty required perfect control, and heaven help the person whose natural eating speed differed dramatically from the social rhythm. They spent the entire meal in quiet anguish, trying to recalibrate themselves bite by bite. A fast eater forced themselves into slow, calculated bites that felt like torture. A slow eater forced themselves into quicker, tense motions that felt downright unnatural. Nobody ate comfortably. Comfort was never the point. The Tudors didn't care how hungry you were. They didn't care how delicious the food was. They didn't care that you'd been working in the field since dawn or navigating court politics since sunrise. What they cared about was whether you performed moderation in all things, including the speed with which you fed yourself. The good news? Eating at the right pace made you look virtuous. The bad news? Enjoying the food at your own pace was never an option. If you thought Tudor table rules only governed your elbows, chewing muscles, and the tragic desire to lick gravy off your fingers, brace yourself. Because the Tudors didn't just police how you ate, they policed what you said while eating. Conversation at the table wasn't casual chatter. It was a highly regulated exercise in social survival. Every sentence, every comment, every nervous laugh carried consequences. One wrong word and suddenly you weren't just an awkward dinner guest. You were a potential scandal, sinner, or political liability. In Tudor England, silence wasn't awkward. Silence was strategy. It was dignity. It was safety. It was frankly the only guaranteed way to get through a meal without accidentally insulting the wrong person, invoking the wrong topic, or revealing something about yourself that others could weaponize later. People didn't stay quiet because they were shy. They stayed quiet because the Tudors turned dinner conversation into a minefield. To understand why conversation was so tightly controlled, you have to understand the Tudor relationship to speech. Words were never neutral. Speech was power. Speech was risk. Speech was the bridge between reputation and ruin. And at a dining table where ranks, egos, and alliances sat elbow to elbow, the wrong words could implode the evening. Thus, the Tudors developed a strict, unwritten code of approved topics. Mild compliments, weather but only if spoken with dignity. Conventional pleasantries, harmless observations. The occasional polite question about a dish. Is this from your estate garden? Not, what is that? Anything beyond that was dangerous. Politics? Absolutely forbidden unless you were certain everyone at the table agreed. And in Tudor England, you could never be certain. Religion? Even more dangerous. Court gossip, a surefire way to either make an enemy or become someone's next blackmail opportunity. Personal opinions, potentially fatal. In short, if it mattered, you didn't discuss it. The Tudors believed strongly for the idea that the dinner table reflected the moral order of the world. If speech became too bold, too lively, or too unpredictable, chaos followed. Conversation was supposed to reinforce hierarchy, not challenge it. A low-ranking person speaking too freely suggested ambition. A high-ranking person speaking too candidly suggested weakness. Both outcomes were unacceptable. This meant that the host controlled the mood. The host set the tone, introduced topics, and signalled when it was appropriate to speak. In many households, talking before the host spoke was considered rude, presumptuous, even rebellious. Speaking too loudly was another problem. If your voice overtook the host's, it suggested you thought your words deserved more attention than theirs. And in a society structured like a pyramid, such a suggestion was almost scandalous. Guests learned quickly, speak softly, speak briefly, speak safely, or speak not at all. Children, of course, posed the greatest conversational threat. Their instinct for honesty and enthusiasm made them natural disasters at Tudor dinners. A child commenting on someone's clothing, repeating overheard gossip, or asking a question at the wrong moment could send shockwaves through the entire room. Parents trained their children ruthlessly, whispering reminders before every meal. Say nothing unless spoken to. No questions, no stories, no opinions. In many Tudor homes, children were expected to remain silent throughout the entire meal, partly for discipline and partly for everyone's protection. Even laughter had rules. You didn't laugh too loudly. Loud laughter suggested you lacked restraint. You didn't laugh at the wrong moment. Laughing at a comment made by someone beneath you could seem cruel. Laughing at a comment made by someone above you could seem mocking. You didn't laugh at anything too clever either, because cleverness could be interpreted as veiled criticism. The Tudors had a complicated relationship with humour. They liked it only when it didn't challenge anyone or reveal anything true. In noble courts, conversation became even more treacherous. Here, alliances shifted daily. Here, flattery had to be precise. Here, every comment was analysed for hidden meaning. Court dinners were filled with people pretending to enjoy one another's company, while quietly calculating the social arithmetic of every uttered phrase. One poorly phrased compliment could look like subtle mockery. Too much enthusiasm for another person's story could make you appear aligned with the wrong faction. Too little enthusiasm could offend the storyteller. And yet saying nothing at all was also dangerous, because silence could be interpreted as disapproval. Thus, diners perfected the art of safe speech, pleasant words that said nothing, compliments about architecture, neutral comments about a recent event, carefully phrased admiration of the garden, remarks so polished and vague they could be used at any table on any day without consequence. Then came the problem of questions. Asking questions was perilous. Polite, gentle question about the origins of a dish was fine. Asking "where did you get this?" in the wrong tone could sound accusatory. Asking someone about their family could be either a friendly gesture or a politically charged mine depending on their personal situation. And asking someone about their work or finances could be interpreted as nosiness, superiority, or hostility. The Tudors did not tolerate nosiness. People guarded their personal affairs like state secrets. Therefore, good guests avoided probing questions entirely. This strict policing of conversation created a paradoxical atmosphere at Tudor dinners. The room was filled with people, yet emotionally silent, filled with noise, yet devoid of substance. Conversations happened, but they were hollow, structured, predictable, pre-approved, and beneath it all, pulsed the constant awareness that words could travel. Anything you said today could be repeated tomorrow, twisted by rumour the next day, and used against you the following week. This made many people practice what could be called defensive dining, keeping their sentences short, their opinions neutral, and their personality invisible. The Tudors knew that meals could expose a person. They knew that speaking too much revealed too much. They knew that silence was safer than sincerity. And so the safest, most refined Tudor diners perfected the ultimate dinner skill, appearing engaged while saying almost nothing at all. The good news, staying quiet kept you safe. The bad news, dinner felt less like a meal and more like a polite interrogation with cutlery. Laughter today is a sign of comfort, warmth, and connection. People laugh loudly at family dinners, laugh uncontrollably at parties, laugh in restaurants without a second thought. It's natural, it's human. But in Tudor England, laughter, especially loud laughter, was something else entirely. It was a controlled substance, regulated as tightly as appetite, conversation, and posture. Laughter wasn't forbidden, but it lived under constant surveillance. Happiness was acceptable, but only if it didn't make noise. To understand why laughter was pleased, you must understand Tudor emotional culture. Emotional restraint was the backbone of respectability. A calm, steady exterior implied a calm and steady character, one who could be trusted to follow rules, preserve social order, and not suddenly challenge or embarrass someone more important than themselves. Loud laughter, unfortunately, was emotion made audible. It revealed feeling. It revealed spontaneity. It revealed vitality. And Tudor society wasn't built for any of that. At the Tudor dinner table, every gesture was measured, every bite was deliberate, every glance was careful, and in the middle of all that delicate, rigid precision, laughter was a blast of chaos. It broke the flow, it drew attention. It created a ripple of unpredictability. That made it dangerous. The Tudors feared loud joy for the same reasons they feared loud anger. Both emotions broke the stance of hierarchy. If someone laughed too loudly, people feared they might also speak too boldly, drink too freely, eat too hastily, or, horror of horrors, believe themselves equal to their betters. A loud laugh could signal lack of discipline, you couldn't control your emotions, lack of refinement, you enjoyed things too openly, lack of humility, you took up too much space sonically, lack of respect, you overshadowed the host's voice, and worst of all, lack of fear, the one emotion Tudor society absolutely needed you to have. Laughter was allowed, but it had to be the right kind, gentle, contained, polite, a soft chuckle, a demure smile with sound barely escaping, a hand covering your mouth if you absolutely must let out a giggle. Anything more vibrant was socially lethal. Picture a Tudor feast. The hall is filled with people sitting rigidly on long benches. Candles flicker. Rich tapestries absorb some sound, but stone walls echo everything else. In this controlled chamber, the sudden eruption of someone barking out laughter was not endearing. It was alarming. Heads turned sharply, servants froze. Someone at the high table squinted, wondering who had the audacity to experience joy loud enough to interfere with the atmosphere. Even worse was laughing at the wrong moment. A joke spoken by someone of high rank? Acceptable, if your laughter was timed politely and contained. A joke spoken by someone of lower rank? Laugh too much and you seem to encourage them, boosting their confidence and suggesting you all shared a social level. Laugh too little and you seem dismissive. Laugh too loudly at your own joke? That was narcissism. Laugh loudly at a joke at the expense of someone of higher rank? That was suicide. And then there were the most dangerous laughs of all. Uncontrolled laughter, the kind that bursts out unexpectedly. Snorts, chortles, wheezes, any laugh that made you clutch your chest or wipe your eyes was a public admission that you had forgotten yourself. The Tudors believed that losing control, even for a moment, implied you lacked the internal governance expected of respectable people. Noble courts magnified this danger. At Henry VIII's court, for example, where a single misinterpreted smile could lead to imprisonment, laughter was a performance. Courtiers learned to laugh in ways that showed appreciation without creating disruption. They developed court laughs, small, elegant expressions of amusement that never rose above the level of a polite exhalation. These were not genuine laughs. They were strategic emissions of air. Genuine laughter, the kind that bubbled up and escaped despite your best efforts, was considered embarrassingly common. It exposed too much personality, it suggested too much comfort, and comfort, in Tudor court, culture was almost a threat. If you felt comfortable, you might become bold. If you became bold, you might speak too freely. If you spoke too freely, you might offend someone powerful. And if you offended someone powerful, well, Tudor prisons were rarely empty. Even in modest homes, where the stakes were lower and the walls less echo-prone, laughter was still a regulated behaviour. A father might discipline a child for laughing too loudly at the table. Eat, don't cackle, was the unspoken mantra. Mothers taught daughters to smile quietly, since a loud laugh was considered unladylike. Too raw, too expressive, too uncontrolled. Women were judged even stricter than men. A woman who laughed loudly was said to invite company, coded language for impropriety. Children naturally predisposed to joy were trained to limit it. A child who shrieked with laughter at something silly, perhaps at a lopsided pie or a dog sneaking under the table, was quickly reminded that eating required decorum and decorum required stillness. Childhood exuberance was treated as a flaw to be corrected rather than celebrated. The Tudors also believed that loud laughter broke the spiritual atmosphere of a meal. Since grace had been said at the beginning, as we explored earlier, meals carried a faint aura of solemnity. Dinner wasn't church, but it wasn't quite playtime either. A loud laugh shattered the reverent mood and suggested disrespect, not necessarily toward God, but toward the ritual, the host, and the hierarchy. And then there was the issue of visibility. The Tudors relied heavily on reputation. A single loud laugh could mark you as unserious, immature, or lacking the gravitas expected of your station. People remembered these things. They stuck to you. Oh, that one? The loud laugher. And in a society obsessed with image, that label could hurt your prospects socially, politically, and romantically. Yet despite all this, laughter still happened. Tudor dinners weren't silent funerals. People enjoyed stories, jokes, and occasional wit. They laughed, it was human nature, but they laughed carefully, softly, modestly, always aware of their volume, always aware of their audience. In the Tudor world, laughter was a luxury, not a right. You could have a little, but only if you behaved. The good news, joy was allowed. The bad news, joy had a volume limit. In Tudor England, the dining table did not treat all guests equally. Men arrived hungry, ate heartily, laughed cautiously, and performed self-control with moderate effort. Women, on the other hand, dined under an entirely different set of rules. Rules so strict, so suffocating, and so laced with social judgment that merely existing at the table felt like a test. If Tudor dining was a stage, then women performed on the narrowest, brightest spotlight, where every gesture, glance, and bite conveyed moral worth. The core belief shaping women's table manners was painfully simple. A proper woman had no needs, not hunger, not desire, not opinions, and certainly not appetite. Appetite was seen as unfeminine. The ideal woman did not eat to nourish herself, she ate to demonstrate grace. Even her hunger had to behave. This meant that women's dining etiquette operated under stricter surveillance than men's. While a man could get away with minor breaches, a faster bite, a slightly louder swallow, an extra sip of wine, a woman risked immediate whispers. The Tudors believed that femininity was defined through restraint. Restraint of voice, restraint of movement, restraint of expression, restraint of self. And nowhere did these expectations manifest more clearly than at mealtime. Women were expected to take smaller portions than men, even if they could worked all day, even if the food was plentiful, even if they were starving. A woman who served herself too much appeared greedy. A woman who asked for seconds appeared indulgent. A woman who showed enthusiasm for food appeared, in Tudor terms, unbecomingly eager. A phrase that conveniently covered everything from hunger to joy to any behaviour too spirited for their comfort. And while men could at least display hunger gracefully, a hearty appetite signalled vigour and masculine robustness. A woman showing visible hunger was viewed with suspicion. Hunger implied needs, needs implied desire Desire implied agency, and agency was something Tudor society preferred women not to have at the dinner table, or anywhere else. Beyond portion size, pace was even more unforgiving for women than for men. Men were expected to eat with moderation, women were expected to eat with delicacy. Men could follow the general rhythm of the table. Women were expected to follow the slowest, most refined person present, often someone at the high table who had the privilege of leisure. If a woman ate too quickly, people noticed. If she ate too slowly, people also noticed. A man's pace was a detail. A woman's pace was a verdict. Then came posture, another battlefield. While men were encouraged to sit upright and confident, women were instructed to sit lightly, composed, hands close to the body, elbows locked firmly to their sides, as if the table perimeter was a holy boundary. A woman leaning forward too far looked eager. A woman leaning back too much looked careless. A woman shifting in her seat looked restless. Everything she did had to convey serene, ornamental perfection. Conversation rules tightened even further. For men, conversation was policed for political danger. For women, conversation was policed for tone. A woman speaking too boldly at dinner risked appearing opinionated. A woman speaking too softly risked appearing timid. A woman speaking too much risked appearing loud. A woman speaking too little risked appearing dull. And humour. Women were allowed to smile politely, but laughter, the real kind, risked undermining their feminine composure. Eating required restraint. Speaking required restraint. Existing required restraint. And while men might occasionally tease or banter across the table, women were expected to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Even their smiles were supposed to be regulated, gentle, refined, non-disruptive. A woman enjoying herself too visibly risked being labelled frivolous. A woman not enjoying herself at all risked being labelled cold. Tudor femininity was a lose-lose equation performed with a knife and trencher. One of the most revealing double standards revolved around messiness. Men could manage food with slight imperfection. After all, they were dealing with bones, grease, trenchers, and communal platters. But a woman had to maintain immaculate cleanliness at all times. No gravy on her hands, no crumbs on her lap, no oil on her fingers. If a woman's hands glistened even slightly, she was labelled careless. If a woman dabbed at her mouth too often, she was labelled vain. Men could be robust, women had to be pristine. Drinking was also heavily gendered. Men could drink ale and wine with relative freedom as long as they did not get visibly drunk. Women drinking too much, even 1 cup more than the invisible standard, risked immediate moral judgment. A woman's sobriety was treated as evidence of her virtue. A woman's loosened tongue, even slightly, was treated as evidence of her moral collapse. Women had to drink slowly, carefully, and sparingly, never enough to reveal personality or comfort. Even serving behaviour was gendered. While men were expected to receive food in the correct order, women were often expected to assist in passing or dividing certain dishes, delicately, modestly, with gestures so soft that they seemed almost subconscious. But they had to do this without seeming assertive. Helping too eagerly made them look pushy. Helping too little made them look lazy. Women were expected to perform invisible labour gracefully, never drawing attention, never claiming credit, always embodying the silent support role society assigned them. The harshest scrutiny of all, however, came from other women. Tudor women policed one another as fiercely as the men did, sometimes more so. A woman who broke the rules reflected poorly on all women, according to Tudor logic. If one woman behaved immoderately, it suggested that women broadly needed more restriction. Thus, the pressure to conform was not only social but communal. And what happened when a woman failed? When she ate too eagerly, laughed too loudly, spoke too freely, reached too far, or simply appeared too human? Nothing immediately, and everything eventually. Whispers circulated, reputation tarnished, invitations thinned, suitors reconsidered. A single dining room misstep could brand a woman as greedy, loud, unfeminine, proud, or improperly trained. Labels that stuck far longer than the stain from a spilled cup. The good news: if a Tudor woman followed every rule, she was praised as graceful. The bad news: grace required pretending she didn't need food, space, comfort, or joy. In Tudor England, children were not simply raised, they were shaped, moulded with the kind of relentless precision usually reserved for forging metal. And nowhere was this more evident than at the dinner table. Before Tudor children learned kindness, before they learned generosity, before they learned anything that resembled warmth or mercy, they learned manners. Table etiquette wasn't just about politeness. It was the earliest form of social conditioning, training the next generation to obey without question, perform without error, and fold themselves into the hierarchy with seamless obedience. Childhood, in Tudor society, was not a sanctuary. It was preparation, and the table was the classroom. The moment a Tudor child could sit upright, they were expected to begin mastering a growing list of dining rules. They learned where their hands belonged, where their eyes belonged, where their elbows absolutely did not belong, and how to behave as if they were already tiny adults. Children didn't get to experiment, explore, or fidget. The Tudors believed that the dinner table was the proving ground for discipline, a place where the foundations of obedience, restraint, and social awareness were built. A child who behaved properly at the table was considered well raised. A child who misbehaved, even slightly, was considered a threat to the household's reputation. The Tudors did not tolerate chaos from children. They did not laugh at accidents. They did not shrug at spilled cups. A child was not just being a child. A child was demonstrating how well or how poorly their parents had done their jobs. The training began early. Before children learned advanced prayers, they learned grace. Before they learned complex speaking etiquette, they learned silence. Before they learned how to share kindly, they learned that sharing required permission. They learned not to reach, not to point, not to slurp, not to chew loudly, not to stare at food, not to play with bread, not to swing their legs, not to wiggle, not to laugh too freely, and not to ask too many questions. If this sounds harsh, that's because it was. Tudor childhood was built on the belief that the household's reputation mattered more than a child's comfort. A child's purpose wasn't to be happy, it was to be respectable. One of the first skills a child learned was stillness. Stillness was everything. A child was expected to sit with their back straight, feet planted, hands either folded or placed gently on the table. No drumming, no tapping, no reaching, no impulsive snatching of a desirable piece of food. A restless child embarrassed the parents, who would respond with swift correction, sometimes a glare, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a discreet pinch under the table. Children also learned the art of waiting to be seated, waiting to be served, waiting for grace, waiting for someone more important to begin, waiting for their turn to speak, which often never came. This constant waiting wasn't merely etiquette. It was psychological training. It taught children to place the needs and actions of their superiors above their own, to suspend their desires, and to internalize hierarchy as natural law. Even the act of feeding themselves had rules. They were taught how to tear bread with delicate fingers, how to hold a knife without looking dangerous, how to take small portions, and how to appear indifferent to hunger, even when their stomachs growled loudly enough for the servants to hear. Hunger was not a reason to misbehave. Hunger was an opportunity to practice restraint. Children who grabbed food without permission were corrected immediately. Patience, parents reminded them. Know your place. These weren't simply lessons in courtesy. They were lessons in submission. By learning not to take what they wanted, children learned not to seek what they weren't born into. Conversation was even more heavily restricted. A child was often expected to say nothing during meals unless asked directly. Speaking out of turn was a serious transgression. The Tudors feared children's unfiltered honesty. Kids had a tendency to say things like, "Uncle Henry smells like cabbages," or "Why does Lady Margaret eat so much pudding?" Comments that could ignite feuds. So children learned to remain silent, to listen, to observe, and to avoid doing anything that might cast the family in a bad light. they were also forbidden from showing strong emotions. A child laughing too loudly was reprimanded. A child crying was removed. A child who sulked or frowned was warned to fix their face. The Tudors believed that outward emotion was dangerous. It revealed inner impulses, and the purpose of manners was to hide impulses so thoroughly that they might as well not exist. If a child succeeded in all this, if they sat still, ate quietly, spoke little, waited obediently, and expressed absolutely nothing, they were praised as well-mannered. If they failed even once, they were marked, sometimes unfairly, as unruly or spoiled. A single spilled cup could follow a child's reputation for months, and all of this training carried a purpose: to prepare children for adulthood in a rigid society. A child who mastered table manners grew into an adult who understood hierarchy instinctively. They learned not to challenge authority. They learned to keep their desires quiet. They learned to suppress themselves for the comfort of those above them. They learned to blend into the system rather than disrupt it. Servant children, those raised within wealthy households but of lower birth, were trained even more harshly. They were expected to exhibit perfect etiquette long before noble children were, because their future livelihoods depended on it. A servant child with poor manners had no prospects. A servant child with impeccable restraint could someday work in fine houses. The greatest irony of all? Tudor society insisted that children be trained into perfect stillness and composure at the table, yet adults regularly blamed children for lacking joy, spontaneity, and warmth. Children learned obedience first because obedience made the household functional. Mercy, compassion, creativity, those came later if they came at all. The good news? A well-mannered Tudor child earned social approval. The bad news? They earned it by learning to silence every instinct that made them human. In Tudor England, the dining table wasn't just a stage for the elite. It was also a workplace, one where servants performed a quiet, relentless ballet of observation, anticipation, and obedience. Servants didn't simply serve food. They maintained the illusion of effortless refinement. They ensured that everything flowed according to hierarchy. They absorbed chaos so the household didn't feel it. What made their role especially brutal was this: their work required them to watch everything, yet they themselves were never meant to be seen. Servants existed in a paradox. They were essential yet invisible, present yet unnoticed, responsible for the success of every meal yet blamed for failure. They were expected to understand every rule, follow every rule, enforce every rule, and still remain socially silent, as if the table operated on its own. No servant could afford even the smallest misstep. The Tudors believed that the behaviour of servants reflected directly on the household. If a servant acted improperly, moved too quickly, spoke too loudly, reached in the wrong direction, refilled a cup at the wrong time, the shame didn't fall on the servant alone. It fell on the master. Therefore, noble families demanded perfection from their staff, perfection so strict that the servants often became more skilled in dining etiquette than the diners themselves. Before the meal even began, servants performed elaborate preparations. They polished trenchers, knives, cups, and candlesticks. They arranged seating according to rank. They placed dishes carefully so that the highest-ranking guest could reach them first. They inspected the tablecloth for wrinkles and crumbs. A single imperfection implied incompetence. A wrinkle suggested laziness. A misplaced dish suggested ignorance of rank. Once the diners entered, servants shifted into their most important role, watchfulness. This wasn't casual observation. This was hyper-awareness, the kind learned through years of correction and quiet fear. Servants studied the table with the precision of hawks tracking prey. They watched for empty cups, subtle gestures, or small shifts in posture that indicated someone needed something. A raised eyebrow meant more wine. A slight lean forward meant, bring the next dish. A barely perceptible pause meant, this meat is too tough, carved differently. Servants had to observe all of this without staring. Direct eye contact with diners was dangerous. Looking too long suggested boldness. Looking too little suggested inattentiveness. Servants mastered the art of the peripheral glance, catching everything while appearing to see nothing. Meanwhile, the diners watched the servants just as closely, though for very different reasons. Nobles judged servants on speed, silence, and refinement. A servant who moved too slowly was useless. One who moved too quickly looked frantic. One who made noise, a footstep too loud, a plate too firm on the table, ruined the atmosphere. And a servant who dropped anything immediately became a story, immortalized in household gossip. Servants lived under surveillance as constant as their own, yet their most important skill was anticipation. Servants were expected to know what diners wanted before diners realized they wanted it. If a guest reached for a cup, a servant should already be at their elbow. If a platter was nearly empty, a servant should vanish the dish and replace it. If a candle flickered, the servant should adjust it. If a noble frowned, servants had to decode the frown instantaneously and fix the issue before the frown became a complaint. Tudor servants weren't just servers, they were interpreters, reading moods as carefully as scripture. Their invisibility wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. During the meal, servants kept their movements small, they folded themselves into corners, they slid behind benches and pillars, they moved with the careful quiet of trained cats. A good servant didn't interrupt conversation, didn't bump someone's elbow, didn't get in anyone's way. A great servant made diners forget they existed at all, but this invisibility came with a cost. Servants themselves rarely got to eat. They certainly didn't dine at the same time as the household, and they never ate in the same room unless explicitly ordered. Instead, they waited, sometimes hours, until every guest had finished, every dish had been cleared, every cup washed, every spill scrubbed, every candle trimmed, every crumb shaken from the linens. Only then were they permitted their own meal, usually of lower quality, often shared standing up, eaten in haste before the next task began. And even then, they were being watched. Senior servants monitored junior ones. Masters commented on servant discipline. Children reported on servant mistakes, believing it was their responsibility to uphold household order from the age of 6 onward. Servants lived in a world where eyes were always on them, evaluating not just their work but their posture, their silence, their humility. The consequences for misbehaviour were immediate. A servant who spoke out of turn might be dismissed. One who spilled wine on a noble's sleeve could be punished harshly. One who forgot to serve someone in the right order risked insulting that guest. A mistake far more serious than the spilled wine. And if a servant accidentally violated the strict dining hierarchy, placing a dish in front of the wrong person, handing someone the wrong piece, moving against the proper passing direction, they might not just lose their job, they might ruin their entire family's hopes for advancement. Even their emotions had to be suppressed. A servant couldn't smile too broadly, too familiar, look too serious, too sullen, appear tired, too weak, or appear proud, too bold. They existed in a tightly controlled emotional cage, performing pleasant invisibility while managing an entire household's expectations. And yet, despite this impossible pressure, Tudor servants developed extraordinary skills now lost to time: the ability to move silently across uneven floors, the ability to carry multiple dishes without shaking, the ability to maintain perfect posture while bending forward, the ability to memorize every household preference, and the ability to mask exhaustion after working since dawn. Their work made Tudor dining possible. Their silence made noble meals appear serene. Their vigilance made the elite feel powerful and attended to. And their invisibility guaranteed that none of this effort received recognition. The good news? If you performed flawlessly, you kept your job. The bad news? Performing flawlessly meant becoming a ghost at your own table. Tudor table manners were not merely guidelines. They were a social language. And like any language, they could be spoken fluently, clumsily, or, in the hands of the bold, weaponized. For all the emphasis on restraint, obedience, and decorum, the Tudors understood one thing perfectly: the power of breaking a rule on purpose. At the dinner table, etiquette violations weren't always accidental. Sometimes they were deliberate, strategic, razor-sharp insults aimed at someone specific. In an era where direct confrontation risked charges of slander or treason, the dinner table became a battleground of subtle aggression. If you wanted to offend someone without speaking a word, you did not need to shout. You did not need to insult their lineage. You simply needed to break a table rule in a way that everyone recognized but no one could openly accuse. Etiquette was rigid, and therefore deviation from etiquette was unmistakable. This was the Tudor version of a cold slap. To understand how these violations functioned as social weapons, you must first recognize the psychology behind Tudor dining. Every rule, every gesture, every pace, every direction of passing communicated respect. Therefore, every breach, when intentional, communicated disrespect. It wasn't the act itself that stung, it was the meaning behind it. Consider seating order, one of the most sacred dining structures, explored deeply in Chapter 3. Choosing to sit slightly closer to someone than propriety dictated, or placing yourself where someone of higher rank should sit, was an unmistakable challenge. The Tudors didn't randomly sit out of place. If you sat too near the head of the table, it implied you saw yourself as nearly equal to whoever dominated that seat. That was a statement, and everyone noticed. Or consider starting to eat first, one of the most blatant violations of rank. Beginning before a superior wasn't a mistake. It was an insult, the Tudor equivalent of saying, "I'm not waiting for you." The action carried a message. You're beneath my attention. Your authority doesn't move me. Your presence doesn't matter. Even the volume of your conversation became a weapon, speaking louder than a superior cut across the hierarchy like a blade. It wasn't merely rude. It declared that your voice was more important. A sudden laugh, timed just as someone of higher status was speaking, could ruin their presence in the room. A comment delivered too casually could undermine their status. The Tudors were masters of weaponized timing. And then there were more subtle weapons, gestures that seemed harmless to outsiders, but were devastating inside the Tudor codebook. Passing food the wrong direction, for instance, as detailed in Chapter 11, could sabotage the entire rhythm of the table. Doing this deliberately, especially in front of someone who valued precision, signaled that you did not respect their household's custom. It was a way of rejecting their authority over the space. This insult was especially effective when performed in the home of a social rival. Oops, you might say. But everyone knew it wasn't an accident. Offering the best piece to the wrong person was another pointed strike. If you wanted to elevate an ally or embarrass someone, you could purposely direct food toward or away from someone based on rank. Giving the choicest cut to someone who didn't deserve it, by Tudor standards, was a political endorsement. Taking it yourself when you shouldn't was a declaration of superiority. These tiny gestures could destabilize entire social groups. For women, whose table manners were even more tightly regulated, intentional etiquette breaking carried amplified meaning. A woman eating slightly too quickly, reaching too far, or laughing too loudly could send shockwaves through a room, not because the act was extreme, but because it blatantly disregarded the expectations set for her. A woman could signal defiance, independence, or contempt for someone else's authority with just a single calculated break in decorum. Servants, too, could wield etiquette as rebellion, though the risks were immense. A servant pouring too slowly, setting a dish just slightly off-centre, or delaying a refill for someone they disliked could communicate grievances without uttering a word. These gestures were small but meaningful in a world where subtlety was survival. Perhaps the most devastating weapon was ignoring someone at the table, not speaking to them, not offering them food, not acknowledging their presence. This was one of the most powerful social attacks the Tudors possessed. Being socially invisible was a punishment far more cutting than open hostility. The Tudors understood that being excluded from the table's rhythm was a direct assault on dignity. Even eating with visible enjoyment could be an insult, if strategically timed. If someone you disliked was sitting nearby, you might deliberately savour a dish they were not offered. You might take your time with a piece they wanted. You might decline to share something they could see but could not reach. Nothing said, "I am above you," quite like enjoying something someone else was denied. But the most potent insult of all was breaking a rule while making eye contact. Reaching across the table while staring at someone, taking the best piece while watching their reaction, beginning to eat before them and smiling faintly. These were the Tudor equivalent of drawing a sword and laying it on the table between you. Not violence, but the promise of it. This was the secret. The rudest act wasn't the mistake. The rudest act was the clarity. Everyone knew the rules. Therefore, everyone knew when you were choosing to break one. And because Tudor society rarely allowed honest conflict, etiquette violations became its shadow duels. Deliberate breach wasn't just about dining. It was about pride, about power, about domination, about sending a message that the other person had to swallow in silence, because calling attention to it would acknowledge the insult and admit vulnerability. The good news? You could fight your enemies without speaking. The bad news? They could fight right back, using nothing but a plate, a glance, or a perfectly ill-timed bite. In Tudor England, dining etiquette did not exist as a neat little list of rules carved into stone. It shifted, stretched, tightened and contorted depending on where you were eating and who was watching. At home, a private meal could feel like a rehearsal. Still rigid, still demanding, still stitched with anxiety, but manageable. A public feast, however, transformed every diner into a performer trapped under 100 unforgiving gazes. The Tudors loved spectacle, and nowhere was their appetite for hierarchy and performance more visible than in the stark contrast between private meals and public feasts. If a private meal was a test, a public feast was an examination with witnesses. Let's begin with the private meal. Even in the sanctuary of one's own home, the Tudor table remained governed by strict etiquette. Families observed hierarchy, prayed before eating, controlled their pace, monitored their gestures, and taught children to sit as stiffly as carved saints. But private meals offered something public feasts never did. Breathing room. A father might allow himself a slightly more relaxed posture. A mother might smile more freely. Children might get away with one small fidget before someone corrected them. Conversation remained cautious, but it felt less like a courtroom and more like a congregation. In private, a person could be imperfect as long as their imperfections were minor, infrequent, and witnessed only by people obligated to love them despite themselves. Public feasts, however, were an entirely different species of meal. Part ceremony, part theatre, part political demonstration. Feasts were loud, elaborate, crowded, and highly performative. They were filled with nobles, neighbours, servants, clerics, visitors, and strangers. They were places where reputations were displayed, crafted, and sometimes destroyed in the time it took someone to chew the wrong way. At a public feast, your manners weren't just etiquette, they were identity, projected into the room like a banner. A single mistake could carve your name into the gossip channels for weeks, and because Tudor society thrived on gossip, these mistakes didn't fade, they fermented. The sheer number of people at a public feast amplified the stakes. More people meant more scrutiny. More scrutiny meant fewer freedoms. Every rule tightened, every gesture mattered more. A public feast didn't simply require etiquette, it required mastery. Consider posture. At home, you might relax your shoulders a little. At a feast, your spine became a military campaign. You sat straight, composed, still. Sitting too casually looked sloppy. Sitting too rigidly looked anxious. You needed to strike the perfect balance, alert yet at ease, dignified yet not cold. Good posture conveyed confidence. Bad posture conveyed unattractive truths, insecurity, arrogance, laziness, or improper training. Pace too grew stricter. In a private meal, you matched the household rhythm. In public, you matched the rhythm of the elite. If the lord or lady of the feast took small measured bites, so did you. If they paused, you paused. If they slowed down, everyone slowed down. Eating too fast made you appear greedy. Eating too slowly made you appear fragile or pretentious. And timing was exponentially harder. when surrounded by dozens of people doing the same complicated synchronization. Then there was conversation. In private, small talk was safer. You could whisper or avoid speaking entirely, and no one would judge you harshly. You could stumble over a word or accidentally comment out of turn and be forgiven because family, after all, had to tolerate you. But at a public feast, speaking was a gamble. You could accidentally interrupt someone of higher rank. You could accidentally agree with someone unpopular. You could accidentally laugh too loudly. You could accidentally start a feud. The Tudors loved hierarchy and hated spontaneity. The more people present, the less likely anyone was to risk genuine conversation. Feasts, ironically, could be louder in noise yet emptier in substance. People spoke but carefully. They filled the air without revealing anything of themselves. A single misplaced remark in public could echo through the hall, land in the wrong ears, and travel from household to household like a winged curse. Feasts were also places of formalised movement. Servants moved in disciplined patterns. Dishes were presented in elaborate sequences. Food paraded in with theatrical flair. Whole roasted boars, peacocks redressed in their feathers, pies containing live birds, a Tudor favourite, though not a bird favourite. Every presentation carried symbolism: wealth, authority, extravagance, and control. These displays added pressure to diners. At home, you might be served modestly. At a feast, you might be confronted with dishes requiring complicated etiquette. Carving rules, passing rules, portion rules, or rules about refusing or accepting offerings from nobles. You couldn't simply eat, you had to perform. And yet, while public feasts demanded perfect behaviour, they also offered strategic opportunities. If you wanted to show your status, you did it publicly, by demonstrating flawless manners, demonstrating silent discipline, or by sitting quietly and letting others make mistakes. Feasts were where reputations rose. They were also where reputations fell. Mistakes at private meals were small domestic embarrassments. Mistakes at public feasts were social catastrophes. Drop a cup at home, your mother scolds you. Drop a cup at a feast, 50 people gasp, 10 whisper, and 3 make sure everyone hears about it again tomorrow. Reach too far in private, you're corrected quietly. Reach too far in public, you've just performed a public display of overstepping your rank. Chew too loudly at home, your siblings roll their eyes. Chew too loudly at a feast, you're officially that person, and the title lasts for years. Public feasts were arenas where social precision mattered more than food. In fact, many people ate less at feasts than at private. Meals, not out of restraint but out of fear. Better to go hungry than to be remembered for the wrong bite. The greatest irony? Private meals felt oppressive, but they were safe. Public feasts felt splendid, but they were dangerous. The Tudors were masters of making luxury feel like surveillance. The good news? A public feast offered a chance to shine. The bad news? It also offered 100 chances to fail, usually in front of everyone you knew. In Tudor England, a single misstep at the dinner table didn't vanish when the candles burned low and the trenchers were cleared away. The Tudors had long memories, sharper tongues, and an appetite for storytelling that made small mistakes grow into legendary failures. In a world where etiquette defined character, breaking a table rule wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a public stain, a social wound that healed slowly, if at all. The Tudors believed deeply that manners reflected not just upbringing but moral fibre, which meant that the consequences of bad table behaviour followed you far beyond the hall. To modern ears, it may sound absurd that a dropped spoon or a misplaced reach could have long-term repercussions, but Tudor society operated on an unforgiving mathematics. Behaviour equals reputation. Reputation equals opportunity. Opportunity equals survival. Every household, every village, every noble circle had its own mental archive of social missteps, and once your name went into that archive, it took years, sometimes a lifetime, to crawl back out. Punishment for bad manners began subtly. A raised eyebrow, a quiet cough, a pointed glance exchanged between two people who thought they were being discreet. They were not. These tiny, immediate reactions were warnings, signals that you'd crossed a boundary. But the real punishment began after the meal. The Tudors were highly social but deeply suspicious creatures. They rarely confronted you directly about your mistake. They preferred to discuss it after you left the room. A single etiquette failure could become the evening's entertainment. And because Tudor meals were long and often repetitive, diners needed something to talk about. Your mistake, whether it was reaching too boldly, slurping too audibly, eating too quickly, or laughing too loudly, became the perfect conversational garnish. By the next morning, the story had grown legs. "He took the best piece," someone whispered. "He slurped his broth," another added. "He laughed so loudly the tapestries quivered," someone else chimed in. The Tudors did not exaggerate, they inflated. A small stumble grew into a fumble. A minor noise became a disruption. A moment of awkwardness became evidence of a moral flaw. And because gossip had no expiration at all day, your mistake lived on. In small villages or towns, shame travelled even faster. A dinner blunder didn't stay in the household where it occurred. It slipped through neighbours, markets, churches, taverns and guild halls. Soon people, who had never even shared a table with you, knew about your table habits. "He's the one who talks before the host," they said. "She's the woman who laughs like thunder," they murmured. The Tudors used shame the way modern societies use traffic signs. It kept order, discouraged recklessness, and reminded everyone that consequences were very real. At the noble level, the stakes were even higher. A dining room mistake wasn't merely embarrassing, it was politically dangerous. A noble who violated etiquette suggested poor breeding, weak discipline, or lack of refinement. This could affect alliances, marriages, negotiations, or invitations to future feasts. A single misjudged gesture, reaching across the table, speaking too loudly, touching food improperly, could mark you as a liability. Nobles didn't want to be associated with people who couldn't control themselves. If you couldn't control your fork, how could you be trusted to control land, wealth, or servants? For women, the shame was harsher. A woman who broke table rules risked being labelled unfeminine, vulgar, untrained, or lacking virtue. Men might recover from a mistake with time, women rarely did. A woman who laughed too loudly at one dinner might find herself uninvited from the next 3. A woman who ate too eagerly might be considered unsuitable for marriage. The Tudors believed that a woman's reputation lived on the edge of a knife, and table manners were one of the ways that knife sharpened. Children weren't spared either. A child who misbehaved became a reflection of the parents. The shame didn't attach to the child alone, it clung to the entire family. A single outburst, spill, or breach of etiquette might lead to whispers that the family lacked discipline, that the household was poorly run, that the parents were careless. This mattered immensely in a world where social connections determined survival. A family with a poorly behaved child could lose social standing as quickly as a family with a questionable lineage. Even servants felt the long arm of social memory. A servant who spilled wine on someone important, passed a dish incorrectly, or arrived half a second late to refill a cup could find themselves demoted, dismissed, or quietly blacklisted. Servants moved from house to house seeking work. Their reputations followed them. A servant who gained a reputation for clumsiness or poor discipline might struggle to find employment, leaving them vulnerable in a society with no safety net. What made Tudor shame especially potent was its longevity. The Tudors did not forget. A dining room mistake could be revived years later in a new context. When someone wanted to undermine you, they might casually mention that time he insulted the bishop by eating before him, or the feast where she laughed so loudly the musician stopped playing. These stories were tools, picked up, sharpened, and used strategically, and the Tudors loved retelling stories. Meals were long, dark winters were slow, and gossip was entertainment. A single misstep could provide dinner conversation for weeks. A vivid one, like knocking over a goblet onto someone important, could become a favourite family story passed down for generations, your name mentioned with a chuckle centuries later. But shame wasn't just about retelling stories, it was about shaping future behaviour. The Tudors believed that public embarrassment reformed character. If someone felt the sting of shame deeply enough, they would behave better next time. Social memory wasn't just punishment, it was instruction. A communal reminder that reputation was fragile and once damaged, difficult to restore. The Tudors may not have had prisons for etiquette crimes, but they had something worse. An entire society determined to remember your mistakes. The good news, the meal ended. The bad news, the embarrassment stayed, long enough for everyone to enjoy it again and again. After 23 chapters of navigating elbows, eye contact, portions, posture, silence, sound, pace, prayer, and the social minefield known as other people, it's time to answer the final question. Why did Tudor society create this impossible system in the first place? Why build an etiquette labyrinth so intricate that a single wrong gesture could jeopardize your reputation? Why turn meals, one of life's simplest necessities, into a grand performance of obedience, restraint, and nerve? The answer is both simple and terrifying. Control. In Tudor England, the dinner table was one of the most effective tools for maintaining social hierarchy. Every rule reinforced order. Every gesture taught obedience. Every meal rehearsed the core values that kept society stable, predictable, and deeply unequal. Table manners were not about elegance. They were about governance. The Tudors believed that people who behaved properly at the table behaved properly everywhere else. Let us begin with the central purpose: routine. The Tudors loved routine, not because it was comforting, but because routine created predictable behaviour. Predictable behaviour meant fewer surprises, and in an era where power was concentrated in a tiny elite and everyone else lived one unlucky harvest away from ruin, routine functioned as a stabilising force. It disciplined people from childhood, as we saw in chapter 19, and reminded them day after day of their place. Every Tudor household, noble, middling and poor, used the dinner table as a daily rehearsal of social order. The head of the table symbolised authority. The passing of food symbolised hierarchy. Waiting for others to eat symbolised obedience. Silent eating symbolised self-control. Even the smallest gestures, how you held bread, where you placed your hands, when you allowed yourself to breathe, reinforced a structure that society depended upon. But routine alone wasn't enough. Fear played an equally vital role. Tudor etiquette was designed to create anxiety. You were meant to worry. You were meant to hesitate. You were meant to look around nervously to make sure you weren't breaking a rule. This constant vigilance ensured that you never felt equal to your betters and never fully secure, even among people who knew you well. Fear kept the hierarchy intact. If you broke a rule, shame followed, as explored in the previous chapter. Shame led to gossip. Gossip led to reputation damage, and reputation damage could affect your livelihood, marriage prospects, friendships, alliances, and even your children's futures. In such an environment, fear wasn't simply emotional, it was practical. It prevented disorder, it disciplined ambition, and it ensured that everyone behaved in ways that protected the stability of the group. The Tudors also believed that obedience was a virtue in itself. In a world ruled by monarchy and enforced by rigid class structures, obedience made everything function smoothly. It made society livable. People who followed the rules were seen as morally superior. People who challenged the rules, at the table or anywhere else, were viewed with suspicion. If someone couldn't master dinner etiquette, how could they be trusted with business, property, religious duty, or political loyalty? And this brings us to the heart of Tudor logic. The table was a microcosm of the kingdom. At the head of the table sat the authority figure. Father, landowner, merchant, noble or monarch, each demanding loyalty, silence and visible respect. Further down the table sat individuals of decreasing importance. The structure mirrored the entire social order. Monarch to nobles, to gentry to merchants, to yeoman farmers, to labourers to servants. The Tudors believed that if everyone learned to accept their place at the table, they would also accept their place in society. This symbolic training began early and continued daily. Even children learned that they were the smallest and least important people at the table. Even servants learned that their presence was conditional and closely monitored. Even women learned that their purpose was to remain composed and invisible. These lessons weren't accidental, they were structural. The Tudors feared chaos, because chaos meant rebellion. Chaos meant social upheaval. Chaos meant people forgetting their place. The Wars of the Roses were still within living memory. Tudor stability depended on submission, and table manners were a constant reminder of that submission. Then we reach hierarchy, the pillar holding everything together. Hierarchy wasn't simply social, it was spiritual. The Tudors believed God had assigned each person their station. Breaking table rules wasn't just disrespectful, it hinted that you were challenging God's plan. Every dinner ritual upheld this cosmic order, from who received the best meat to who ate first to who enjoyed the luxury of speaking without fear. By mastering etiquette, you demonstrated respect for the divine, structure of the world. This belief made etiquette oddly moral. A messy eater wasn't just unattractive, they were undisciplined. Someone who reached across the table wasn't simply rude, they were presumptuous. Someone who spoke too loudly revealed inner disorder. In this worldview, every table rule became a moral test disguised as a dining habit. And what of pleasure? What of joy? What of simply enjoying a meal? Pleasure wasn't the point. The Tudors viewed pleasure with suspicion. Pleasure hinted at excess. Excess hinted at greed. Greed hinted at disorder. Disorder hinted at rebellion. They preferred meals that made people anxious because anxious people behaved. A relaxed table invited relaxed minds. Relaxed minds asked questions. Asked questions led to disagreements, and disagreements were the seeds of revolution. Better to keep the whole population slightly on edge. Which is why, in Tudor logic, these strict manners weren't oppressive, they were necessary. They preserved harmony. They taught humility. They reinforced divine order. They kept ambition firmly leashed. They ensured that everyone behaved in a way that sustained the fragile stability the Tudors feared losing. Did these rules make meals miserable? Absolutely. Did they make conversation unnatural? Without question. Did they create lifelong anxiety over how to hold bread? Every day. But did they help maintain the social order the Tudors believed kept the world safe? Yes. And that was enough. The good news, you survived dinner. The bad news, everyone remembers how you held your bread.